So great. We'll begin in a moment. And before we begin, let me just offer some logistical announcements. We're so grateful to have everyone here with us today. If anyone who is a participant runs into any particular problems, technical issues or problems, you can email policy@jubileeusa.org. If you have a technical issue, you can also email, or not email, you can use the chat, which goes directly to the staff and the host to be able to help you resolve any technical issues that you might have. In terms of this particular conversation, as well as the events today, we want everyone to join the conversation. You can ask questions or make comments in the Q&A function. And the Q&A function, when Zan is going to be our moderator today, he will be using those questions he sees to be able to give that back to our wonderful group of panelists today. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, you can also join the conversation. If you're one of the hundreds of people that are currently watching us on Facebook Live, what you can do is put a comment in the Facebook Live section. The staff will take that comment and also direct that question to the moderator. On Twitter, you can join the conversation by hitting #Jubilee or use @JubileeUSA. You could tag us, and participants can also send us comments and questions in that particular vehicle. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the beginning of the amazing panel that's been organized with the leadership and partnership of Caritas Ghana. At Jubilee, we want to offer a very special thanks for the work that Caritas Ghana partners have been doing and the amazing work in terms of bringing this panel together today to talk about issues facing as well as Africa. And we're tremendously excited both to have with us the Honorable Finance Minister from Ghana, as well as His Excellency Cardinal Turkson. I would like to just, as we begin and as more people are joining this conversation, right now, as we've already talked about in some of our panels, discussions, the work that many of us are doing, we're facing a crucial moment in terms of the global financial crisis. And we're also dealing with a challenge with this coronavirus crisis that is leaving many developing countries left out of decisions around aid, financing, debt relief, and being able to access resources they need. This certainly includes Ghana right now. Right now, across the world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, we're going to see some of the most significant job loss, some of the most significant raising rates of extreme in the so-called developing middle-income countries, which constitute the majority of countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean. And so far, the G20, IMF, and world leaders have been leaving these countries out. And what it means is that 500 million jobs are projected to be permanently destroyed, according to the International Labor Organization. Across Africa and around the world, 300 million people are now experiencing famine for the first time. And we're seeing extreme poverty rate increases from 150 million to 400 million people, depending on the numbers you're looking at. So today, with this focus on Ghana and what's happening in Africa, this panel today is going to be crucial to be able to continue that conversation in our work. We're going to kick off this panel by first inviting some remarks from His Eminence Cardinal Turkson. Everyone on Facebook Live, as well as the attendees, know the Cardinal very well and his leadership at the Dicastery for Integral Human Development. He has been one of the most important global speakers on the financial crisis, as well as working with the Holy Father and other global religious leaders to move forward real solutions to this particular crisis. We're so grateful to have Cardinal Turkson with us today. who's going to kick off our panel by speaking to what is Pope Francis's vision for an inclusive economy and the moral argument for debt cancellation. We turn it to you, Cardinal Turkson. And I know it's late in the day there, and you are always so generous with your time. So grateful that you could be with us for this global event today.
Well, thank you, and it's good afternoon or good evening, wherever the participants and people on this program are. So thanks for inviting me and having me on this program to speak about Pope Francis's vision in this regard. As you know, since the beginning of the present, healthcare crisis, because that's what the COVID-19 issue is, the Pope has quickly drawn our attention to the fact that what began as a healthcare crisis is not simply a healthcare crisis. So it's not to be limited to a public health, issue or crisis. In fact, his words are that this small crisis, small not in the sense of its impact and effect, but small in the sense of the cause. Okay, a small virus is caused a crisis which has on its own, unveiled and expose several other social crises. So the crisis of the pandemic, a public health issue or healthcare issue, is revealed a lot of other social crises, essentially being what, Eric, you mentioned. So financial, economic, joblessness, tourism, travel, all kinds of businesses are affected by this. So this is where the Pope begins, and his intervention or his response to the COVID crisis is already taking several forms of sending donation, equipment to hospitals and all of that. But he's also invited us to take this on a thinking level, on a level of reflection, to see what the causes are, what the implications are, and how to prepare the future. That is his expression. He's not saying prepare for the future. His expression is prepare the future. It just means that you look at the present and you look at all the issues which the COVID-19 virus has unveiled and brought up. And then prepare the future means work towards a future that can deal with all of these shortcomings and make the future more robust, more sustainable, and more supportive of human life and human existence. So when we look at the COVID and its impact, a big part of it is we're talking about Africa in a lot of this. Our own office, by way of responding to this call of Pope Francis, we developed a commission we call the Vatican COVID-19 Commission. And the commission has 5 working groups. Okay, one working group takes, establishes contact with all the local churches, find out how they're dealing with this crisis, and just, ask about their challenges and situation, how the Vatican or the Holy See can be of support. There is a second working group which is more reflective, intellectual, does research into all the issues affected by COVID. So there is the thing about healthcare, public health, access to good healthcare, the thing about joblessness, the thing about food security or insecurity. All of these issues are being looked at. And then we look at communication, and then we look at the Vatican's role as a state in its relationship with other states, how it can do advocacy or get states to come together to do anything. But underlying all of this, the Pope comes up with one thing. The big thing that the COVID unveils is inequality. Basic systemic inequality that exists within our system that needs to be addressed, and takes the form essentially of economic financial inequality. So this very much resonates with what Pope Francis had already been talking about even before the COVID virus and its infections broke upon us. So it is the crucial issue of inequality in our economic, health, food, all kinds of systems we have to sustain our life suffer on a great level of inequalities. And that's the big thing that Pope Francis will have to deal with. And when it comes to this, His own big thing has been this, that we should try to work on an economic system which includes everybody and which leaves nobody out. And when the Pope says this, it very much resonates with what in 2015, when Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, was presenting the Sustainable Development Goals, his language was that the Sustainable Development Goals were a human dignity narrative that leaves nobody behind. That's essentially what it is. What the world is going through now under the COVID onslaught is that an exposition of several dignity deficits around the world on account of joblessness, on account of food insecurity, on account of several insecurities. There are a lot of dignity deficits are being revealed all over. And that is what we are invited to address and to help deal with and to challenge. Concretely and shortly, in a lot of ways, several of our groups always come up with the economic factor as the key to unlocking a whole lot of these, economic, dignity deficits around. And so when we have to look at that, Pope Francis has consistently, invited us to recognize the fact that money must always serve the human person, and the human person may never be reduced to serving money. Okay, this is a thing that he said. And he put it graphically when he said that the newspapers, when the stock exchange falls by 1 or 2 points, it makes the headlines. When a poor man dies on the street side, along the street on account of exposure, cold, and whatever, that doesn't make the headlines. It just means that our value system is kind of warped out of shape. And we put value on the things that don't require value, and the real essential things are left aside. And the real essential things for the Pope and for us as a church is the human person. This is the one thing that we believe God created for its own sake. The garden in Eden, that was created to support human life. But human life was created for its own sake. It doesn't support anything, and that's why any attempt, economic or non-economic, whether we call it what we call in our writings technological paradigm or anything, when anything comes up that threatens or that pretends to reduce the human person and make it serve an economic gain, an economic interest or whatever, we need to come strongly against that. The human person and his dignity is the one thing that God, even if you want, admires and also respects. So it is so important for us. So if the COVID situation brings us to a situation where the dignity of the human person is so badly compromised as to be able to be, to put anywhere, that for us is a wake-up call. We need to get all what we can, marshal all our forces to come to promote that. And the way of doing this is several. We just therefore, I know we have 1 hour for 4 people, right? So I have basically 15 minutes. So on account of this, I simply want to say that the challenges that we face, whether it is a COVID or whether it is economic or whether it's economic challenge exposed by the COVID, is to recognize that essentially the crisis before us, or crisis before humanity, is an anthropological crisis. It's a crisis about the human person, how we value the human person, what place we assign for it in our economic and any system that we have, and how we cherish and promote its dignity. So the lesson for this is, let us develop systems that do not compromise or create dignity deficit for the human person. The second thing that we want to draw attention to and talk about in this regard is to recognize that there are, in connection with this, a lot of errors. As old as way back as the days of Plato and Aristotle, they came out with the principle that every citizen in a society has a responsibility for the well-being and the common good of other citizens in society. That's way back. This was not before the church came out with the social principles of the social doctrine. Already in the days of Aristotle, they thought that every citizen in a society has the obligation and responsibility to work for the well-being of others in the society. This is why we promote and we also strongly push. And the thing that fights against this sense of communion, because we say that the human person is a relational being. It's a relationship not only with God, his creator, but one another, and even with the Mother Earth on which we live. And these relationships have to be nurtured, developed, and cultured. And that's why any form of individualism that diminishes the sense of our belongingness. And these days with the COVID, the cry that we're hearing from all sides is that this is a challenge that has to be addressed together. In our global character, either as multilaterals or whatever, we need to come together to address this as a group. That is what the nature of the human person as a relational being calls for. We need to come together, work together in any system that emphasizes individualism to the point of leaving other people out or putting other people on the periphery. It's a thing that does not augment, that does not promote the well-being of the human person. And in the light of that, we would want to encourage all involved in this conversation, seeing how quickly we have to run with this, that in the light of all of this, our thoughts should go more for the well-being of the human person, for promoting the dignity of one another, because there cannot be a situation where an individual lives in full dignity when another individual lives in poverty or is excluded along with the side. So the inclusive economy that Pope Francis talks about is an economy that promotes the well-being of all of us, well-being of all human people. The history of this goes way back. This is not the time to go into a history of the development of this concept of inclusive economy or inclusive development, but that's what it is. We, as a relational beings, are interrelated and interconnected one with each other. And there's no way we can promote an aspect and leave the other, and there's no way we can promote one and exclude the other. So indifferentism or any type of relativist concept and thinking that makes us promote certain individuals and groups and leave others are stuff that we cannot tolerate and live. And so initially for this introductory observation, this is just what I like to say. Inclusive economy or inclusive development, as Pope Francis teaches, it's a system of thought that would help us develop a certain sense of consciousness and awareness and recognition of the human person as a relational being related with others, who must be developed in relationship with others and who cannot be abandoned by any way to live on the side. Basically because it's got this dignity that must be promoted by all systems that we create in our society without leaving anybody on the periphery. Thanks.
Thank you, Cardinal Turkson. That was absolutely incredible, both in terms of offering us the complexities of the situation, but also reminding all of us that we have a very simple situation in the sense that we must be quality to be able to deal with these global Jubilee issues. As we continue the panel, I'm very excited to hand it over to our amazing moderator, Samuel Zan Alakoloba. Zan is going to offer moderation for the panel, introduce the other speakers today, and today's event would not be possible without the leadership of Caritas Ghana. We're excited over the coming weeks and months to work closely with Caritas Ghana on issues facing Ghana and Africa. So Zan, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much for your leadership today.
Welcome, Eric, and thank you really so much. We at Caritas Ghana are also greatly indebted to Jubilee USA for this partnership, a clear example of what collaboration, cooperation can do. So we are very happy. And you set a very good stage. I don't want to go into all those details. So let me just start by saying greetings to all who are joined to this either by online or following us live on Facebook or social media, because it could be morning to some people, could also be afternoon or evening. And so greetings is appropriate. So Your Excellencies, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I simply say welcome. As you can see, the moral imperative has already been so very well established by His Eminence, Peter Cardinal Turkson, in terms of setting the stage for this, that it's not just a technical economic issue, but it's also a moral question that enjoins us to address what he called the dignity deficit. And that looks at the whole thing as a relational issue. Of course, we also do know now that the impact of COVID-19 will disproportionately affect African countries and other poorer countries than it will do for the developed countries. Therefore, something needs to be done about it. There is now the challenge of increased spending to address some of the issues. At the same time, we have shortfalls in revenues, we have job losses, all those that have been recounted. And so, as Eric said earlier, our own country, Ghana, here is not. We are faced with the same situations. Fortunately, we are lucky to have undoubtedly one of the best, finance ministers in Africa, at least for that I can say, who has been addressing this at all levels, policy, but also in terms of programmatic interventions. And so it's my pleasure now to present Honorable Ken Ofori-Atta, who is Ghana's finance minister. And as I said, one of very outstanding difference in terms of his role. In fact, let me just say Ken, because he's also a good brother and friend. He has such a profound profile that one is tempted to go through all of that, but then that would be at the sacrifice of his time to speak. So I will keep it very simple. Honorable Ken Ofori-Atta is the current chair also of the Board of Governors of Africa Development Bank and the governing board of the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. So it's not just looking at issues of Ghana, but also Africa. There is so much to say. Let me just say that he is also a married person to Professor Angela Ofori-Atta, who is also a distinguished professor. And they are so blessed with 3 children. And I dare say one of the things I admire about him is that he brings his. It is now my honor, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, to invite Honorable Ken Ofori-Atta to speak to this issue in terms of what are the technical challenges and what they have been doing in Ghana and the level of Africa to address all of these issues. And before I turn over to Ken, let me just repeat that those of you following us online, you can either tweet, if you are tweeting, use @Jubilee and tag Jubilee USA, or you can also just say @Caritas Ghana, and then that will come direct to us. On this note, once again, ladies and gentlemen, Your Eminence, Your Excellencies, it is my pleasure to invite the Minister of Finance for the Republic of Ghana, Honorable Ken Ofori-Atta, to respond and speak to this issue. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kalogo. It's very generous of you, that introduction. And thanks for the panel and the opportunity indeed to be here. Also, a big thank you to Jubilee for stringing this together. And it is truly a privilege always to be on a platform of His Eminence, Cardinal Turkson, and for you, the other members of civil society and the Christian faith. So let me express again my profound gratitude to Caritas Ghana for the numerous charity activities you've undertaken since '71 to bring smiles and restore a sense of dignity to those less fortunate across our great country. I have made no secret of the fact that this government's economic programs is intentional about promoting inclusive growth and to create a fairer society through fiscal redistribution to the working poor and the rural poor without disturbing the industrial state. In my first statement in Parliament in 2017, I spoke about economic freedom to make sure that people are educated and therefore there should be social mobility by also strengthening the financial infrastructure. I also spoke quite a bit about preferential option for the poor, which sounded strange for a center-right party, but we've always believed, as the president has always believed, that really the issue of any pride of any country is about building a confident society where there's social mobility and social justice. And we have gone ahead to be very forthright in that with a number of flagship programs that is ensuring that there's education, there's health, there's decentralization of businesses across the country. So I just really want to thank Caritas again, and then may the good Lord continue to bless your efforts and the work, some of what you do. So as we speak, we are facing a pandemic which has subdued growth and prospers across the globe and has brought to the forefront the need for all nations to work together in the spirit of shared sacrifice and service in order to create a people-centered planet working in partnership for peace and prosperity for all. As of yesterday, the WHO reports about 47.5 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, 31.6 million recoveries, and 1.2 million deaths. Of particular concern, of course, is the fact that we are yet to reach the peak of the outbreak, with countries across Europe bracing for a second wave of infections. The UK has just instituted a second lockdown, which will last through 2nd December, in order to curb the spread of the virus and ensure that we celebrate crisis life in December. Fundamentally, COVID-19 has disrupted lives and livelihoods and caused the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The journey back will be tough and tedious, especially for the developing world. And I have always stated that our recovery is not V-shaped or U-shaped, but trapezoid, because we're going to descend, for about 3 years before we are able to recalibrate and recover. In truth, though, African governments moved quickly to implement lockdowns, travel restrictions, and other measures to slow down COVID-19 infection rates. Part of the reason many argue for the lower COVID-19 rates on the continent today. Since the onset of the pandemic, Africa has recorded approximately 1.8 million cases and close to 44,000 deaths. In terms of infections and deaths, clearly we fared better than other regions. The US, for instance, is roughly 4% of the world's population, but is responsible for 19% of the total COVID deaths globally, whereas Africa is 16% of the world's population, but only responsible for 4% of total COVID deaths. Clearly, we have coped well with containing the virus. We are not sure whether it's because of our youthful population, whether it's our experience of infectious diseases such as Ebola, and of course the leadership that has been shown by some African leaders, and the whole sociology of Ubuntu, which comes to bear at these times where we instinctively care for our neighbors. Across the continent, governments are facing falling revenues, rising expenditures, increasing debt distress, and significant reversals in development indicators. Even now, as Paul Collier has written, even in these times, there's a clear transfer of wealth from Africa to the West. And that is a twist of fate. That is unfortunate. African resources are flowing to the West due to A, lower commodity prices, which means they pay less than they should for our products, reduced tourism, fewer flights coming in, capital flights, which is hurting our ability to build our infrastructure, at least 20% reduction in remittances, and then, of course, the purchase of PPEs and medications from Western countries. We also cannot ignore the broader impact on educational systems, healthcare, and attempts to reduce the incidence of poverty on the African continent. This truly is a human tragedy. The more the pandemic hits our economies, the less likely Africa will be able to meet the 17 SDG goals. The international community cannot stand by as 38 million people in Africa alone slip into extreme poverty. Now is not the time for the world's great economic powers to turn inward and focus on their own survival. Ghana, its response had been swift. Ghana represents one of the few pockets of resilience on the continent's efforts to protect lives and preserve livelihoods, coupled with the impact of the pandemic on revenues and expenditures, resulted in economic growth being revised downwards from an initial 6.8% to 0.9%, and an overall fiscal deficit of 4.7% to 11.4% of GDP for 2020. It was clear from the beginning, as the president stated, that, and I quote, "We know how to bring the economy back to life. What we do not know is how to bring people back to life." So the Ministry of Finance was then charged to do all it could to ensure the sanctity of our people and our citizens. So by God's grace, COVID-19 has therefore not been as deadly as initially feared due to the president's leadership. That's our preoccupation has been addressing the socioeconomic dislocations occasioned by this pandemic. We move swiftly to mitigate the threats to lives and livelihood by implementing a COVID-19 emergency preparedness and response plan, about $100 million, operationalizing the 1.2 billion corona alleviation program to support businesses, supporting the 3 billion credit and stimulus package by commercial banks, support industry, offer strategic support to income increases, and life insurance in excess of 320 million to incentivize health workers and allied professionals, supporting households and businesses with electricity and water, funding the provision of cooked food to about 1.8 million people in Accra and Kumasi metropolis. This is a compassion that Ghanaians deserve, and which the president promised. And what was interesting about this program was that government had already created a social partnership with the faith-based organizations, and so they came to work on this and were very effective in ensuring that food was distributed in Accra and Kumasi. So far, we have approached this situation quite well, and now as we move to 2021, clearly there's increased optimism. We expect growth to rebound strongly from what we now expect to be a 1.9% growth for 2020 to 5.7% growth in 2021. The increased optimism is largely predicated on the implementation of the transformation and revitalization phase of Ghana Cares 100 billion CD Obatampa program, which is a quarter of our population. And here the president was also very clear. He said, COVID-19, I quote, gives us an opportunity to recreate our country, an opportunity to do something meaningful. This is a challenge and we must seize it. The Ministry of Finance then put together this 100 billion Cares Obatampa program to really look at accelerating the program of Ghana Beyond Aid and economic transformation for our country. And this program aims to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the lives of our people and to ensure that we quickly emerge from the pandemic with a stronger and more resilient economy. For Africa, it has been difficult. With about over $625 billion in debt, the region easily paying about north of 44 billion of debt servicing each year. We are in a situation that is difficult. Compounded is that there's a number of rating agencies also downgrading sovereign status, leading to less access to the capital markets and much more expensive even at this time. And that then becomes the issue that my colleagues and African finance ministers have taken up. Clearly, quoting John Maynard Keynes, if you owe your bank £100, you have a problem, but if you owe $1 million, it has a problem. How do we then let people sit up for enlightened self-interest so that the private sector, the rating agencies, countries like China and the US will come together so that we find a means of getting around this problem which is affecting everyone. So, for example, you consider Senegal, one of the continent's most stable democracies, created by the IMF for its economic management, and yet it pays 5 times more on its 10-year note than Greece, the epicenter of Europe's debt crisis in 2008, which, funnily enough, has a lower credit rating than Senegal. With average growth of over 6% for the past 5 years, Senegal still pays 3 percentage points more than similarly rated Serbia, whose economy expanded at half Senegal's pace. To place this in a more local context, Ghana's borrowing are more expensive than that of Belarus, a country rocked by protests against its autocratic leader since August. The Eastern European nation, which issued notes in June, still pays 1 percentage point less than similarly rated Ghana, a much more stable democracy. Once you consider this, you start to realize that this perceived riskiness of African economies definitely goes beyond an assessment of economic fundamentals, credit, and default. We need reforms across the entire global financial architecture. The world needs to demonstrate the fierce urgency for change. We must all ask, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him on earth? And this is looking at the Good Samaritan story. In an unprecedented global event of this scale, it is urgent that advanced and developing countries work together on ambitious reforms to shape an inclusive international financial architecture, and more importantly, to save our common humanity. By 2020, Africa will be a quarter of the world's population and have the largest youth population. We cannot afford not to create prosperity on this continent. So what are the African finance ministers been asking for? Really a call to righteous action. African finance ministers have been advocating for the structure of a credit-enhanced special liquidity and sustainability facility for triple-way wraparound to make it cheaper and easier to access capital markets. From a liquidity standpoint, African finance ministers have made calls for 300 billion in fresh liquidity. This against the 12 trillion that OECD countries have pumped into their economies. This is barely 2.5% of what they have been able to do. We do have the resources, and the miracle of the 2 fish and 5 loaves is indicated that there's more for us to have 12 basketfuls when that is done. The courage of leadership is what we now need. The G20 did come up with the debt suspension initiative, which has really helped with our liquidity, but truly it is not debt reductive because it is NPV neutral, which ensures that the amount of money we pay in future to the people, to our creditors, still remains. So the challenge now is to build a global coalition of some sort to really confront what we are going through and use this as a remarkable opportunity to really recalibrate the world. Lives are at stake, and we cannot keep resolution tools such as debt cancellation, debt relief off the table. They must be on the table. Africa is not begging for support or charity. As Larry Summers pointed out recently at the G30 summit, supporting Africa is the West opportunity, or is the Western countries' opportunity for forward defense of its interests in being able to export, to avoid revolutionary situations, to maintain peace, and the avoidance of an upsurge in refugees. To top it all off, Africa is asking for nothing from Western taxpayers. We are asking for liquidity to do either debt relief or cancellation or the issuance of new SDRs. On the global scale, these demands are a drop in the bucket of what the OECD countries are doing. Support and advocacy from key stakeholders, such as official sector and the religious community, is urgently required, particularly in relation to working closely with rating agencies and financial regulators to enshrine a fundamental and ultimately crucial distinction, i.e., going for debt relief is not a signal of elevated risk of default on outstanding obligations, and as such does not warrant downgrades. Such downgrades will only deny much needed market access to low-income countries and amplify the adverse effects of the pandemic. The world is truly at a critical juncture. Public spending on healthcare and education, social services, welfare protection, and key economic infrastructure is vital. Without the fiscal room to breathe, from comprehensive debt relief, or in some cases debt cancellation, Africa could truly become the forgotten continent. We cannot allow this to happen. And I really thank you for this platform, and I look forward to working closely with you to make the tectonic changes that we need for the global financial infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. This really very strong and compelling statement. We know the problem. We have a strategy, and we now have to think about how we can mobilize the forces to make sure that this is delivered. We have now less than 20 minutes to bring this to an end. So we need to move on. We have two other panelists, and before I invite them, let me just say that the third panelist, who is Mrs. Clara Bere Kasati, put it you will keep her in prayer and in good thoughts. Now, the rest of the interveners will have maximum 5 minutes just to make some comments. And so I'm going to go straight to Dr. Ajepoma Jechida. Doing all the and teaching, but also looking at how that research can bring about the finance minister setting out the policy framework, but also some of the concrete programmatic actions. It's my pleasure to invite you now to make some remarks in the context of the conversation we are having this evening. Dr. Ajepoma, welcome. Hello, Dr. Jeche Dako, are you there? Very good.
Yes, I'm here, but I can hardly hear you. It keeps fluctuating. It goes on and off. I don't know whether you can hear me, please.
We can hear you very well.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Please go on.
Okay, so go on.
Okay, I didn't hear your question. I'm sorry. If you can repeat your question.
No, I basically said that, did you hear His Eminence, the Cardinal, speak? Did you hear the Finance Minister? I basically said that you are in the field of academia, teaching, researching towards finding solutions. What do you have in where we are faced with the dilemma, great challenges of, a humanitarian crisis of COVID on social, economic, and human lives?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that yes, please. Yes, thank you. I think that the Bishop, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for this platform. And I think that the platform has been set very, very well for this discussion. I like the premise that was initially set by Cardinal, and it had to do with ensuring that every intervention that actually takes place in the face of this pandemic is inclusive. Because usually when we go through issues like these, there is the tendency to rationalize expenditure. And in our attempt to rationalize expenditure, we tend to forget about the people who actually need the help. And you would, as you have all agreed, this pandemic has actually brought to bear the problems that were already in existence, that we were always overlooking. And even with the interventions that the government was actually giving or has actually given in the face of this pandemic, we've seen that some people could not even take advantage of them because they don't even have the basic amenities that they are supposed to be having. So, for instance, we clearly saw government trying to intervene in terms of electricity, in terms of water, so free water and subsidies for electricity. But because some of the vulnerable people did not have such amenities, it obviously made it difficult for them to even benefit from some of these interventions. So it's important that as we try to rationalize our expenditure as a country, we do not lose sight of the people who are at the bottom, who really, really need our help. In terms of support that has been given locally, the national support that has been given, I think that the government has been very swift in its response. It's done quite well in some of the interventions that it's brought to bear, like the finance minister, like Honorable Minister just reiterated. They have tried to support businesses. They have also subsidized water, electricity. They have built some infrastructure, giving medical facilities, resources, etc. Looking at the international world as well, some support has come in, but it would have also been good for them to give us, they have given some relief, as we all know, in terms of the moratorium and then some other support to the medical field, etc. But we would never say no to more support. We still require some support, especially to some targeted sectors of the economy, to help us wean ourselves from the international world gradually. So as the aid is being given to us, it has to be targeted. It has to go to the right places. It has to be used for investment purposes so that we'll be able to wean ourselves gradually from the international community. Honorable Minister mentioned that our debt is going up. Of course, in these times, there isn't much we can do about the situation. We would have to borrow to salvage our situation. But in borrowing, we also have to make sure that we are using the funds that are borrowed responsibly. We are using it for investment purposes so that we'll be able to pay off and not just accumulate the debts that we are accumulating. So this is as far as I can go for the moment. If there's any other thing that I have to add on, I'll do so.
Intervention. And you, Mr. Aldo Celari, policy advisor in Jubilee USA. And also, you have led many civil society campaigns. I'm tempted to go personal. We've worked together many years back in the days of Amnesty International concern. It's now my pleasure to invite you also to make remarks looking at this from the global context where you deal with finance institutions, etc. So over to you, Aldo. Hello, Aldo. Yes.
You can hear me? Okay. It's
yes,
a pleasure
we can hear you.
Thank you. I want to say something about the debt and the additional finance and the illicit financial flows in the international community response to the coronavirus crisis. So just about debt, we in Jubilee USA, we have been making a consistent plea for essentially two things in the response. One is a suspension of the debt payments. We started very early this year, right after the crisis erupted. We sent letters, worked with the chief of the IMF and sent a letter to the G20. At this moment, we have a letter outstanding to the G20 that has gathered more than 220 organizational signatures. So suspension of debt to provide breathing space for countries to figure out what is the extent of the damage. That is the essential ask. But also, we have been calling for a debt cancellation process with the involvement of all the creditors and covering all the countries that need debt restructuring and with transparency and accountability in the use of funds. And I want to start there because at the moment there is a G20 decision that has been we are awaiting. No, there has been a decision to have a debt cancellation. Sorry, it's called a common framework for debt treatment beyond the suspension. No, the suspension was approved earlier this year, but now this common framework is on the table. We are very expectant about what that's going to entail because this is very important because under the existing tools and architecture that we have a situation where debt reductions tend to be too little, too late, and where there are delays of debt restructuring that ultimately carry higher costs for all the parties involved. And we hope this is a lesson that we can learn from the heavily indebted poor countries initiative. No, there are this cost that they are not just the delays are not just costly for the debtor; they are also costly for the creditor. So it is in everybody's interest to come together and find a better framework. In the HIPC initiative, for example, you look at the debt of these countries in the early 80s, and the debt to GDP ratios were of 38%. You look at the second half of the 80s, and they already had jumped to 70%. And then at the beginning of the 90s, and they had jumped to 120%. So in spite of the multiple and increasingly growing rescheduling that then turned into cancellations for these countries, the system was trying to catch up with the evolving problem, and it wouldn't catch up fast enough. It is clear that if the problem had been tackled in the early or in the middle of the 80s, the amount of funding needed to solve the issue for these countries would have been a lot less than what the debt cancellation initiative ended up costing in the early 2000s. So we need an efficient process, and an efficient process means one that can provide decisive action to reduce debts now because that is the only way to avoid years of stagnation for these countries. And another lesson to learn from HIPC was the target thresholds that were used. You may remember there were these 150% debt to exports. And also the idea was to get countries' debt back low to that level and provide the amount of relief needed for reaching those target thresholds. And there was a lot of discussion over whether these were the right thresholds to use or not. But the discussion was, did these thresholds allow for countries receiving enough debt relief or maybe not? But there is nowhere in the literature you'll find that somebody is saying that maybe some countries received too much debt relief as a result of the thresholds. Huh? No, nobody says that the thresholds were set in a way that countries ended up over receiving debt relief, so to speak. So it would be very good if there could be the adoption of these thresholds as a basis and say, okay, we need to first of all get all countries down to that level of debt, and then work on additional debt relief for countries that may need additional debt relief. But it is very clear that that is a good threshold that could be used as a basis. So for this process to be efficient, it needs to be a process that is not going to stigmatize countries that seek a debt restructuring. I think it's very important to realize countries here are victims of an exogenous shock. Part of the reason why we have these delays is because countries feel stigmatized when they try to pursue a debt restructuring process. And that should not be the case. There should not be this stigma attached to debt restructuring. So that's what I wanted to say about debt. I want to also speak about additional finance in concession of the cheap terms, which is something that Jubilee also has been pursuing in these petitions and letters to G20 leaders. So the special drawing rights, like the minister has mentioned, is a reserve asset that the IMF could issue. We have been calling for a new issuance of at least 3 trillion. We have been saying at least 1 trillion, but it would be actually 3 trillion would be better because of the lopsided way in which these assets are allocated when the IMF issues them. The developing countries only receive a very small part of them. So even though we don't have a liquidity problem overall in the world of 3 trillion, for developing countries to receive the liquidity they need, the overall allocation needs to be in the 3 trillion. So if there is an allocation of 3 trillion, developing countries will receive about 1 trillion of that, and African countries will receive a bit above 100 billion of that allocation. That is how skewed the allocation is. So you compare that 100 billion that African countries could receive with the estimate that the IMF makes, that between now and 2023, the African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, would need some 290 billion. There are different scenarios, but they say the middle scenario is 290 billion, but nobody knows exactly where they are going to come from. So even that amount of SDR would not cover completely what developing countries or what African countries need, but it would cover a good part. We have made some progress on at least making sure that the issues fall off the agenda of the G20, but there is a lot more work that we need to continue doing on the SDRs. There is also the possibility of advanced economies transferring their SDRs so they could support poor countries. There has been also a bit of progress on that. Yeah. You're saying? Okay, I'll just continue. Just 1 minute and I'll finish. So the possibility of transferring the special drawing rights that they do not use to for supporting poor countries, and some of this is making progress within the International Monetary Fund. We also, the proposal that the minister mentioned for additional finance through liquidity and sustainability facility, that is a very important proposal to try to lower the significant risk premium of African countries. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know what to do about that. If it's in my system or
So we got the message, which is to in the international.
Zan, I think that it might be your connection. I think, Aldo, if you wanted to maybe continue, I think that we could maybe just kind of wrap this up here.
Yes, I will just say we also.
I'm hearing Aldo very well.
So, well, the other point I wanted to make was about international cooperation to combat illicit financial flows, and there is a lot of we have been working here at the domestic level in the US on some legislation to make the incorporation of companies more transparent. So, you know, a lot of the opportunities that now exist for funneling funds out of African countries through illicit financial flows, whether they are crime related or corruption related or related to tax avoidance and evasion, to remove those opportunities from the system. We are also working at the level of the United Nations. There are a proposal that we have been promoting. We still need to complete the unfinished agenda of the Addis Ababa conference on an inclusive forum for international tax cooperation that better provides, better contemplates the needs and the issues that developing countries face in raising tax revenue. So those were the points I wanted to essentially make. Thank you very much.
This is Eric. I wonder if we lost Zan with
hello. It's just
so Zan, I don't think you're coming through very clearly.
Eminence and other. Technical. Okay. From Peter, Claudio, Scott, Thomas, Joshua, at least we wrap it up in the 5 minutes. Your Eminence, any concluding quick remark?
I think Zan's we're not getting a full connection, and I think Zan has invited Cardinal Turkson, if you wish to make any closing remarks or thoughts, as well as the Honorable Minister Hanofta. So let's just turn it over for any closing remarks to His Eminence Cardinal Turkson and His Excellency Minister Ofra Atafa. Cardinal Turkson, you're on mute.
All right. Hello? Are we through now?
We can hear you, Cardinal.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. No, I think by way of conclusions for tonight, I think is to bring our thoughts a little bit together. With deep appreciation for what the minister presents as a government's program dealing with HIV/AIDS. I think all of it comes together with the initiatives of the Jubilee group. This sense of solidarity of a common family and the need to come together, I think is what has motivated the Holy See's own gestures over here contacting all local churches and see how it can be of support. But on international level, it's also been what has motivated, the Catholic to be supportive of Jubilee's own initiative, either with the debt cancellation, the postponement of payment of debt, enabling countries with their government to use whatever resources are available, to keep their populations alive. We know that we did send a request at some time to the World Bank and try to, get the World Bank to be supportive, whatever, but they gave us a whole list of the initiatives that they themselves were undertaking. But I think this is a great moment to celebrate solidarity. Solidarity as individually, we reaching out, the different groups gathered for this webinar, reaching out to help people, but also solidarity coming together to address these challenges together, each from our different point of view with our endowments and what we're able to do best. So I think we want to thank Jubilee for your initiative. I think it may be, we just were hoping that by the fall, we'd be able to take stock about, of how many people were able to benefit from the postponement of debt payment or the debt cancellation and all of that, all the initiatives undertaken. But with the resurgence of the COVID, we're just invited to reprogram again and probably, to commit to still pursuing the, our conversation with the World Bank and IMF. But most importantly, with the so-called other small, not even donor countries, but other financial actors whom national governments in Africa readily and quickly get indebted to. So-called the sharks of them, they use the expression shark for them and all of that. I don't want to get into that terrain, but to see how we can also be of support, engaging them in conversation, to not limit their thing only to, if you want, fiduciary absolutism, getting the best that they can get from their loans and whatever, but to a sense of humanity a little bit. I'm happy about what the minister said. The president of Ghana is supposed to have said. We know how to revive economies. We don't know how to bring somebody back from the dead. This attitude, probably this sense of humanity, can probably accompany not only big financial organizations like the World Bank and all, on whose doors Jubilee 2000 is knocking and on whose door we knock and all of that, but also the small financial institutions which also lend monies to African governments and African states to enable them to do things. They probably could also be listening to some of this conversation and not be so hang on to absolutizing their profits and gains, but out of a sense of humanity also to kind of help the poorly indebted countries be able to put their lives together, as it were.
Thank you so much.
Ken, thank you. Okay, sorry, we are doubling.
I think Zan was asking, Honorable Minister, do you have a closing thought?
Sure, thank you very much. And let me really thank you indeed for this platform. I think truly we are just really at a critical juncture, in sort of global economics. And the challenge as we see it from here, that it's not really a question of the emerging markets or developing economies not being able to pay their way through this, but just a fundamental unbalance of what we have assumed to be a fair and equitable way in which the global financial architecture is programmed. And as you begin to question the why, you just begin to realize there's a lot more resources to be shared to create a much more prosperous society that we have assumed to be the only way to go. To move away to much more of an economics of mutuality, where the issues of power and resources are subjugated to, a prosperous planet of partnership. And you look at how skewed the issues of rating agencies, the issue of the pricing for commodities, the issue of illicit financial flows, and you are quite clear that a rethink or recalibration will lead to a world of much more dignity, and as the Cardinal mentioned, to really eliminate the dignity deficit that we are getting so used to. So I look forward to really collaborating with the Holy See and Jubilee, in bringing together a group of parties that think this way and are committed to recalibrating what the Bretton Woods is defined as into a new Bretton Woods. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. And Zan, I think we're having a connection issue with you, but really want to just thank all of the panelists for joining us today, especially for the leadership of Caritas Ghana, who organized and is promoting this event. And please, everyone, look for follow-up from Caritas Ghana and Jubilee USA as we move forward very specific campaigning work for the people of Ghana, as well as to address more of the issues that the Honorable Minister raised facing Africa. So thank you all so much. I believe that I'm turning it over now to Aldo Cagliari, and we do have a presentation on climate finance from Kevin Gallagher, one of really the most incredible experts on this issue. So let me turn it over to Aldo, and again, thank Caritas Ghana, all of the panelists, the Honorable Minister, and the Cardinal for joining us. Aldo, I turn it to you.
Thank you very much. This session is about financing a climate resilient and just recovery. So we know that even amidst the COVID-related financial crisis and economic crisis we are facing, we also have a climate crisis. Jubilee has been working for many years on climate finance issues, working on getting debt relief and aid for countries hit by weather-related shocks, including Caribbean and other small islands. And now, as countries within their possibilities try to stimulate their economies to set them on a path to recovery, we face what is an opportunity, but also a need, a very pressing need that the funding packages be consistent with the climate resilient recovery. The IMF has committed to a climate resilient world and a green recovery, and we want, as Jubilee, to hold the IMF to those commitments. Jubilee also cares a lot about making sure that in whichever path is pursued for the recovery, that is climate resilient, the needs of the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, are at the center. So we have invited, the pleasure of counting with one of the most renowned experts on this field, Kevin Gallagher. He's the director of the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University's Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies. I won't take more of your time. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me first echo, endorse, and the prayers and thoughts that folks shared this morning, and also the moral sentiments that were expressed in the last panel discussions about the dignity deficit. I'm an economist, but I've always believed that the role of the economist is to help policymakers find out the ways that policies can be implemented in the most efficient and cost-effective manner based on society's needs and wants, and that it shouldn't be the role of the economist to tell policymakers in society what those goals should be. And in that spirit, I've been asked to talk about how to finance a climate resilient and just recovery. I have 3 points. One, that emerging market and developing countries, as we've been talking about all day, are facing simultaneous health, climate, social, economic, and have a looming debt crisis. The global community is stuck in what I call a Kindleberger trap, where nations are not cooperating to provide global public goods, especially at the International Monetary Fund, the G20, and to a lesser extent, but importantly, the DFIs. We need global action now to grant nation states and civil society the fiscal space to combat the virus, to protect the vulnerable, and mount a green and inclusive recovery. Developing country growth prospects are worsening. Back, if you look at the circle here, back in April, the IMF thought that developing countries were only going to contract by 2.3%, but those numbers have been revised upward to 5.7% by the end of 2020. There's a looming debt crisis. The red line here shows that the amount of credit rating defaults for emerging market and developing countries is an all-time high, higher than any crisis that we've seen in the past 40 years. The World Bank just released information that shows that by the end of 2020, that the world might see 150 million more people pushed into poverty. And the Earth is on track to have the second hottest year on record. We're literally running out of Latin names for all the hurricanes that we're experiencing in the Caribbean. There's been floods in Central Africa, cyclones that have been ravaging India and Bangladesh this year. For the first time in recorded history, the Great Lakes in my country, in the United States, didn't even freeze. Temperatures have been soaring in the Arctic, melting permafrost and fueling devastating carbon-spewing fires all across the world. And this summer, Baghdad reaches 125 degrees and it melted door handles. In my own country, we've already experienced in 2020 over 16 climate-related weather events that have cost municipal governments and state governments over $1 billion. We've heard a lot about the fires in California and Oregon, but those have just been one of at least 16. We need to shoot for the skies. First and foremost, at the global level, we need to mobilize resources for emerging markets and developing countries to attack the virus, protect the vulnerable, and mount a green and inclusive recovery. To echo what a lot of folks have been saying already today, that means a major new issuance of special drawing rights at the International Monetary Fund, new resources that are quota-based at the International Monetary Fund, debt relief and cancellation for those countries that need it, tax justice, meaning closing loopholes in the global tax system and shifting taxes away from goods and towards bad. We need a stepwise increase in development finance. And very importantly, we need to re-regulate financial markets so they serve our social and environmental goals rather than be ends in and of themselves. We're going to need policy space to do that. Many of our trade and investment treaties make it more difficult to put in place the policies that we need. And we're going to need to reform the IMF on a number of fronts. With those, we need to invest in what I call the skies. Sustainable infrastructure is always one of the most important things in a recovery because it has the most what we call multiplier effects. It's where the public sector can go first and the private sector can follow. We need investment in knowledge, health, and decent work towards full employment. Investments in innovation, economic diversification, and fundamentally energy transitions towards a zero carbon economy by 2050. This needs to be done in a manner that puts equality and justice at the very beginning. As we transfer from one kind of economic system to another, we have to make sure that no one is left behind. As a matter of fact, we need to put people first. With all these ingredients, we'll get stability and economic growth. Interestingly, in one of the chapters in this year's World Economic Outlook that isn't talked about so much, the International Monetary Fund has shown that if some of these kinds of policies are put in place, that the recovery will be stronger than it would be under their baseline conditions. In the chapter on climate mitigation in the WEO, they say that if there's a fundamental tax shift that is close to zero in the first worst years after the crisis, of course, but then gradually moves from taxing goods to taxing bads, that there's a 10-year massive green infrastructure push, that there's 10 years of subsidizing renewable energy transitions, and very importantly, that there's compensatory transfers to the poor, to workers and firms in incumbent industries that need to be shifted away from. They find that with such a package, that the recovery would be larger and faster than under baseline condition recoveries, and that the long run economic benefits would be about 10 times larger than what they would be. Well, let's see how the IMF has been acting and the G20 has been acting. First and foremost, I think we need to put a somewhat of a round of applause for Kristalina Georgieva, because for the first time at the very top level, we have a managing director saying all the right things. Right after the crisis started, she came out right away and said that these are the times for which the IMF was created. We're here to deploy the strength of the global community so we can help shield the most vulnerable people in a revitalized economy. Her economist said that the emerging market and developing countries need $2.5 trillion mobilized in 2020 and 2021. And she herself called on that one of the key ways to do that is to boost global liquidity through a sizable SDR allocation. And in every speech that she has, she notices and mentions that this recovery, different than the others in the past, needs to be green and socially inclusive. Unfortunately, she hasn't had much support because the world is what I call a Kindleberger trap. The economist Charles Kindleberger wrote a book called The World in Depression, which is a book about the 1933 London Economic Conference, when unfortunately world leaders also came together to try to combat the world's worst economic crisis until this one, the Great Depression in 1933. But unfortunately, Great Britain was not willing to step up and play the role that it had traditionally played for the past 50 years to try to provide global public goods. And the United States was also not ready to step in and be isolationists. That's what we're in right now. The United States is stepping back from multilateralism, but unfortunately they hold the veto power and the economic power in many of all these institutions and have been really holding it back. With all due respect, our friends in Western Europe, our friends in China and across the world have not stepped up to fill that void. And even if they did have the leadership, the institutions are such that they wouldn't be able to voice that in a way that would translate into votes and change. So of all these key things that need to happen, SDRs, extended swap facilities, new resources, debt relief, cancellation, and suspension, most of it has been blocked, except for the CCRT, which is important but small, and the debt service suspension initiative, which is important but small and not complete enough. These things amount to hundreds of millions of dollars of relief. And if our denominator is $2.5 trillion, we're stuck in a Kindleberger trap. And this is an emergency situation. My institute has put together something called the IMF COVID Recovery Index. You can go play with it. It's very interactive here, but it basically grades all of the IMF programs that have been put forth since the crisis. There's been over 100 of them, and grades them all on a scale of 0 to 3. And the IMF doesn't do so great. It gets a 1.82. But to their credit, if you look at the top there in the rectangle that I squared, they get a pretty good grades on encouraging countries to support the vulnerable, encouraging countries to put together the right kind of health policies to combat the virus. But they're doing a terrible job when it comes to encouraging countries to use IMF resources to support a green recovery. And this is the distribution on the green recovery part of our index. Oops. On the green recovery part of our index, as you can see on the far left there, just about all of the programs have no discussion about green recoveries whatsoever. There have been a handful of exceptions. You can see those two on the right. They support adaptation and mitigation efforts in Bangladesh and have environmental taxes over time in Costa Rica. But by and large, the IMF's rhetoric is very strong, but its action on a green recovery has been very weak. What's worse, and earlier we had friends from Eurodad present, and I've got a table here from their latest report called Arrested Development, is that even though the IMF is encouraging certain countries to spend now on health and poverty while ignoring the environment, they're basically signaling to countries that that they're going to have to pay for that with fiscal consolidation into 2021 and to 2023. That's really trading away their future. The United Nations estimates that about 30 to 70% of all the tax revenue from emerging market and developing countries is going to pay for external debt. That's in the face of low commodity prices, the trade slowdown and bottlenecks, basically a stoppage in tourism and capital flight, which leads to exchange rate depreciation and a ballooning of debt. If the International Monetary Fund was going to be more serious about a green and inclusive recovery, they would try to put in place the kinds of policies that they modeled in the chapter in the World Economic Outlook. They would improve their program design and implementation and not have fiscal consolidation be at the core for poor countries, but to have counter-cyclical recovery packages that are aligned with zero carbon by 2050 that put people first and had just transitions into those new sectors. When they moved into surveillance, they would be examining the physical risk, the climate risks of different countries and how that impacts fiscal and financial stability. Sometimes you hear folks at the IMF say, gosh, those countries in the Caribbean, they're so profligate. They just spend and get themselves into financial crises all the time and show up at our front door. Well, that's because all they have is a hammer and all they see is nails. The real problem with many of those countries in the region, yes, sometimes there's profligacy, but the bigger issue is these countries are susceptible to hurricanes all the time. And since most of the assets are in and around tourism and areas that get wiped out by these hurricanes, these are climate disasters that impact their financial and fiscal stability and what bring them to the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has to change its lens into its surveillance efforts so it can help countries prevent and mitigate those kinds of disasters. And that has to show up in advice. A reformed International Monetary Fund would be helping countries do what they put in those models: subsidize transitions over the next 10 years, invest in major sustainable infrastructure projects and knowledge and innovation, closing tax loopholes and creating a fiscal system that allows countries to domestically mobilize resources in order to meet these broader goals that we have. In addition to that, we need a new multilateralism. Hopefully President Biden is going to emerge as the new president of the United States, and to his credit, he has endorsed the SDR allocations. He is much more into multilateral institutions, and I think civil society organizations all around the world need to call on, whether it be President Biden or not, the world to hold an emergency G20 meeting to put the world back on track in February of 2021 after the inauguration. The United States has been trapped in this Kindleberger trap, trying to stall every one of the major policies that has been put forth by developing countries and civil society on these issues. We need to reset this. We're in a world crisis of nothing like we've seen since 1933. We need coordinated national commitments for green and inclusive recovery, shooting for the skies, that cute acronym that I just came up with. Those are our immediate needs, but we also need a global commitment for reform of these international institutions. We need to reform the governance. We just learned that it's a real problem if one country has the power to veto all the good decisions that come up. We need to improve the scale. We don't have the firepower to deal with $2.5 trillion worth of need in the environment development, emerging market and developing countries. We need to align these institutions to our sustainable development and climate goals. We have to make sure they're effective. And none of that can happen without civil society mobilization, monitoring, holding these institutions accountable, and having a seat at the table to make sure that these things come into action. That's all I have to say. I want to leave this up because what's amazing is that the Paris Agreement 2.1c says that it commits nations to making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. But it recognizes the needs of developing countries. It recognizes that all these things have to be justly done with food security, developing countries, human rights, rights to health, rights to indigenous people, rights to local communities, migrants, children, and persons with disability at the core of the entire agreement. We need to start taking these words and putting them into action. And I know that's pretty hypocritical for someone to say from a country that just officially withdrew from the Paris Agreement yesterday. I want to invite you all to a big event that we're going to co-host on November 16th with the Honorable Mia Mottley and Gordon Brown, the UN Special Envoy for Education, where we're going to be calling for a global debt cancellation for those countries that need it across the world, and that is calibrated towards financing a climate resilient and inclusive growth path for the world economy. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kevin. Just a reminder for those who may be just tuning in, you can submit a question via the Q&A box. If you are following through Facebook, you can also use the comments tab Also, we encourage you to tweet live about this meeting. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag Jubilee, and you can also tag us with Jubilee USA. And if you have any technical issues, please email policy@jubileeusa.org, or you can send a note through the chat box. Please note that the chat box is only to be used, it can only be seen by the host. It's not that not everybody can see what is written in there. I don't see any question coming right now through the Q&A box, but I am going to maybe ask you one. We're going to try maybe to close in the next 8 minutes. We run a bit late, but can you say a bit, Kevin, about when you talked about the surveillance of the physical and transition risks? So one thing is what the IMF can do country by country, examining the risks, and providing advice for financial institutions in developing countries. But there is also a role about surveillance of the big economies and what they do. And we know that a lot of what's happening in the climate field, it's really, there is a lot of like small countries taking the effects of things that happen in the big countries and that have taken place in the industrialized world for many years. And so what role can the IMF play there? It's, I don't want to use this lingo because many of our members and partners are not deep into IMF jargon, but so we call it spillovers, which is essentially what are the effects of the policies in a country like the US, for example, or like some of the industrial economies in Europe or Asia, the effect that their policies have in the susceptibility to natural disasters in developing countries. If you can say a bit about that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk about that, Aldo. So the way that the International Monetary Fund does its surveillance is it does these individual country sort of Article 4 reports and then scales them up in the Global Financial Stability Report that it does every year to try to look at the global economy. And they are charged also to do what are called, like you said, spillover reports, which just mean what are actions in the advanced economies and larger economies that might affect smaller ones across the world. And I mentioned more physical risks, say the hurricanes in the Caribbean and how it affects financial systems. The other one I had on that slide is called transition risk. So let's say the Europeans, which in the advanced economies are doing a lot to transfer their economy away from fossil fuels and to have support and adjustment for poor people to move into new investments. The European Investment Bank is putting all that at the center of its goals. So say you're a small island developing country or a developing country where a lot of your exports are natural gas or oil-based exports. If you're a country like Angola and that's your entire motor, if all of a sudden you see industrialized countries shifting away from certain sectors that are the cornerstone of sectors in emerging market and developing countries, that is exactly the kind of transition risk that the International Monetary Fund should be identifying and working with emerging market and developing countries to prevent and mitigate. In this case, mitigate, to help the Angolas of the world shift away from those sectors, diversify their economic activity, and in so doing, putting people at the front of that transition so that they're not left behind and that the whole country isn't left behind. That could happen in a negative way too. Say there's a country like the United States that isn't complying with these transitions and slows down and continues, say, to create demand for Mexican oil, even though Mexico only has about 15 years of it left. 40% of its revenue from its government, for its government, comes from the state-owned oil company. And so that if the U.S. slowed down and continued to on a very high carbon path, that would create even more dependency for Mexico. And then if there's a new president, if the United States decides to get back onto the track of decarbonizing its economy, a country like Mexico would experience extreme shock. It already has 85% of its exports hinged on the U.S. economy. A big part of that are oil exports. If all of a sudden the United States stopped using oil, which it'll need to by 2050, that's going to have huge impacts on the Mexican economy. That's the direction that the world economy has to go on. But many emerging market and developing countries, all the way back from colonial legacies, have become dependent on these important natural resources. And in fact, that's the way the North industrialized their own economies. And so they're copying that same kind of extractive path. What's important, role for the IMF in endorsing finally a move towards a low carbon economy, zero carbon economy by 2050, is that it'll be central to their role to identify these transition risks and help emerging market and developing countries make those transitions, especially in their fiscal and financial systems.
Thank you. And I think I would imagine, it's also about making sure that the transition is just, like that the most vulnerable. This is a very important point for Jubilee, that the most vulnerable in those transitions are protected and shielded from the effects. So
absolutely, that's what I meant by putting people first in the transition. There are going to be sectors that will be no longer viable, either because developing countries make the choice to make the shift, or because their main source of their exports have decided to make the shift and will no longer import things like natural gas. Their natural gas, coal-based electric power plants, these things provide electricity for people. These things provide major amounts of tax revenue and growth for developing countries in general. And these things are the source of entrepreneurship in many emerging market and developing countries. We can't leave that entrepreneurial spirit behind. We can't leave those people behind. Those people have to be put first. We can't leave people behind in this transition. We've seen what's happened when countries like France made mistakes like that, just tried to rush into these transitions without thinking about the workers and the people in the sectors that are being transitioned away from and diversified away from. We need to learn those lessons and make sure that people are put first and that there's a just transition, not just within countries, but just across countries.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And also for reminding us in your first slides also how much many of these other priorities that we have been discussing earlier, the promotion of sources of finance through special drawing rights or debt relief, and debt cancellation, and how all of these are related, interrelated to the ability of countries to mobilize the investments for sustainable infrastructure, for other, innovations, and for making these transitions just. So I do not see more questions in the Q&A box. So I think I'm going to close. We are 1 minute before 2:10. So I don't know if there is any last closing thing you would like to say, Kevin, and then we'll close the session.
Sure. Just to put that last point into context, absolutely. Without those global measures like special drawing rights, debt relief and cancellation, and the mobilization of new finance, a just transition and a green recovery cannot happen. The global climate change and global just transition movements around the world have been working hard to mobilize finance at the tune of about 2.2% of GDP, additional to what's already been being mobilized towards these transitions over in between now and 2030. This is not the time to put that aside to try to deal with this crisis. This is the time to put that in the center of a crisis management and crisis recovery program. And so there's no difference between these two things. We need these overarching sources of liquidity and new finance so countries have the fiscal space to mobilize resources. What countries need to do is to make sure that those resources are aligned with these broader roles. And there's a huge role for international institutions to manage that cooperation in a way that maintains sovereignty and just transitions. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to address all of you folks.
Thanks to you, Kevin, for being with us today. And I'm going to invite now, I guess we're going to switch now to the next session, which is on Puerto Rico, another important part of our agenda. So Puerto Rico emerging from debt crisis and disasters with resilience. And I don't know if we already have our panelists present. Just for those who are just tuning in, again, you can submit your questions via the Q&A box. If you are following through Facebook, you can use the comments tab Also, if you're tweeting, please use the hashtag Jubilee, or you can tag us at Jubilee USA. And if you have technical issues, you can email policy@jubileeusa.org or send a note to the host through the chat box. The chat box is not public, it only goes to the host. So very excited about this next panel. We have some of our very active partners and members working on the Puerto Rico agenda for us. We're calling this session Emerging from the Crisis and Disasters with Resilience. Puerto Rico, as some of you know, and I think this is a good segue from the last session, because we were talking about weather-related natural disasters, and Puerto Rico is is in a situation where after several years of lingering that crisis and economic crisis, was hit 3 years ago by 2 hurricanes on a row, huge hurricanes. And then early this year by an earthquake, a series of earthquakes actually, and now is suffering the effects of the COVID pandemic that are bad everywhere in the world, but obviously in an economy that was already shattered, more problematic. We have been working, we worked several years ago on setting up, working with Congress members and with administration, a process for the bankruptcy, the equivalent of a bankruptcy process for Puerto Rico. That process is facing now some challenges. I hope we can discuss a bit of this today, some of the current crossroads that this process face. Now we are 4 years from the setting up of the bankruptcy process. But also this year, we have been working with 11 religious leaders from Puerto Rico to ask for the stimulus plans that Congress was working on, to include additional disaster recovery monies, to include measures to bring back manufacturing jobs to Puerto Rico, and the authorization of an additional $1.2 billion for the nutrition assistance program. And we have had some successes in that regard. So there was a recent announcement to awarding 13 billion additional disaster relief funds, which is still far from the 70 billion that we estimate still need to be mobilized for disaster recovery. But it was a positive step forward. This was an announcement last September. There was a House stimulus legislation that still hasn't passed Congress, but passed the House, including our demand on nutrition assistance program. And Congress also approved the legislation with additional food aid that will help feed 300,000 school children in the island. We know that there is a very high, it's about 60% child poverty rate in the island. And then there has been an expression of support from the White House for the measures that we were calling for to bring back pharmaceutical manufacturing jobs. So it hasn't been all doom and gloom, but we need to do a lot more work. And I have 3 distinguished panelists that are going to help us discuss what the next step should be on our agenda on Puerto Rico. So the first I'm going to invite to speak, to make a 5-minute presentation to kick us off on our discussion is Laura Esquivel. She's the Vice President of Federal Policy and Advocacy at the Hispanic Federation. Thank you, Laura. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aldo. You can hear me fine, correct?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Aldo. Thank you, Jubilee. I'm very excited to be here with people who I have worked with and who care about Puerto Rico, and just really want to thank you, Jubilee, Eric, for your leadership in really raising and keeping debt issues for all countries, the unfair debt issues and debt burdens for all countries in the forefront of Congress. For them to understand the impact that so much of our foreign policy has in these areas. And Jubilee turning to Puerto Rico, people are surprised. It's like, Puerto Rico is not a foreign country. Why are we talking about their debt issues? And, I think Jubilee has just done a tremendous job raising raising education about why and how, Puerto Rico's unique situation in the United States has really created to finding itself in a similar situation as many of these countries that have been taken advantage of by lenders, by debt funds, by vulture funds. And really what Jubilee cares about and what we care about at Hispanic Federation is the impact on everyday people in these countries, in these communities of this tremendous debt. Hispanic Federation was founded 30 years ago, mainly by Puerto Rican organizations in New York, to advocate for equitable funding for the nonprofit and community-based organizations that serve our communities. We are a non-disaster relief agency, but we found ourselves running the largest private relief effort on the island after Irma and Maria, which we began by chartering the first relief flight filled with first responders from New York 2 days after Maria made landfall. We've opened an office on the island in 2019 where we administer our programs and invest in building local capacity. So I'd encourage you to go to our website, learn more about our work in Puerto Rico. But in keeping with our philosophy, we believe that local nonprofit and community-based organizations are in the best position to steer the recovery and rebuilding of Puerto Rico. For that reason, we've committed over $40 million to date to support over 120 local groups and initiatives across the island that are delivering ground-up innovative projects, all built around long-term recovery, resiliency, sustainability, and increased self-sufficiency and community empowerment. And the title of this presentation is about the resiliency and creating resiliency in Puerto Rico. And I can tell you, Puerto Ricans are resilient people. The creativity, the vigor, the energy that Puerto Ricans are bringing to rebuilding the island is just tremendous. But we cannot just keep saying it's up to the resilient people. They're so strong, they need help. When disasters strike, our country and our government should be there to help. And as you pointed out, that help has been very slow in coming to Puerto Rico. Debt is the main focus of Jubilee, or one of the main focuses, and the connection between what I see as one of the major things that needs to change in order for Puerto Rico to rebuild is the inequitable treatment of Puerto Rico in terms of federal resources. The fact that Puerto Ricans do not receive the same level of federal benefits, whether it's in Medicare, food stamps, all of these things is one of the contributing factors that created the situation for Puerto Rico to have to borrow so much money in the first place. Other states, other entities in the United States do not need to borrow money to feed the people in their state, in their island, in their community that do not have enough food to eat. Puerto Rico is placed in that position because of the inequitable treatment, because of the lack of parity in federal funding. There have been some recent lawsuits that have made it clear that what the federal government does in this area is discriminatory. So I'm not sure, how much people are informed about this issue of the lack of equity. But if you are retired or disabled and you're a Puerto Rican, you live in Florida, you get the same amount of SSI, of disability, of food stamps as anybody else in the mainland U.S. If you move to Puerto Rico, you get less. And so there have been some recent lawsuits saying that that is discriminatory. Why should it matter where I live? Why is it if I live on the island that I get penalized and don't get as much help as if I did when I lived in Florida? And the judges said that that was discriminatory. That case, there are two cases now. A man moved back to Puerto Rico, and you know what? The Social Security Administration sent him a bill, because they said, you live in Puerto Rico now, you're not entitled to that much money. We want you to pay it back to us. This is a man on disability. So there are some cases that have been brought. This administration, the Trump administration, has appealed those cases to the Supreme Court because they, I don't know the reasons that they have for not wanting low-income people in Puerto Rico to receive the same amount of federal benefits, but it's connected to the debt. it is one of the factors that results in the government of Puerto Rico having to borrow money. I will just say very quickly that if there was a silver lining that has come about as a result of Maria and Irma, it's that people are aware of the situation in Puerto Rico in a way that they were not before. People only thought about Puerto Rico as a beautiful place, to go take vacations. And they just were not aware that Puerto Rico has the highest number of people living in poverty, the highest rate of poverty, highest rate of children living in poverty in anywhere in the United States is in Puerto Rico. And in large part, that has to do with the inequity in federal benefits. So I think ahead of us to create a resilient Puerto Rico, there are many, many factors. The Puerto Rican people are the ones to lead that, to lead the recovery, to lead the rebuilding, but they cannot do it without fair treatment from the federal government. There are a number of bipartisan bills that, we hope with a changed political situation, they might be able to get passed. But when Puerto Rico starts getting treated equitably by the federal government, they will be in a much stronger position to rebuild and to capitalize on the incredible resilience of the Puerto Rican people.
Very much, Laura, and for reminding us that there are root causes, root reasons for this debt that we also address, even as we try to address the debt itself. Now I'm going to give the floor to Adi Martinez Roman, who is the senior policy analyst at Puerto Rico at Oxfam America. Adi, the floor is yours.
Hi, Aldo. Hi, everybody. Thank you for this space. As Aldo said, my name is Adi Martinez. I'm senior policy analyst for Puerto Rico at Oxfam, and I salute you from San Juan, Puerto Rico. And I'm going to share a presentation with you. So bear with me for a second while I do this. Okay. Good. Do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, Adi, we see.
Good. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the priorities that we at Oxfam have identified in the need for a just and equitable recovery in Puerto Rico. We have been in Puerto Rico since after Hurricane Maria, but Oxfam has been 7 years in the world, around the world, working with humanitarian and disaster recovery initiatives. So the work that we have done stems from that experience. But let me remind you of the situation really fast. After years of economic recession, bankruptcy in 2015, and austerity measures due to the Promesa bill, we get hit by Hurricane Irma in September 6th, and then Hurricane Maria in September 20 of 2017. So that was 2 Category 5 hurricanes within 2 weeks, 3 weeks space. Then in December 28, 2019, earthquakes started. And they haven't stopped in the south of the island. Add to that the COVID-19 pandemic that started this year, and you see even higher levels of vulnerability in the island. So this is an island stricken by a lot of types of disasters and a lot of type of disasters. And what we have seen in this bleak scenario as the main challenges to recovery, as Laura says, there is a problem with equitable treatment of Puerto Rico in the federal level, and it's really related also to the hyper-centralization and the incapacity of federal and local agencies to address local issues. There is 2 agencies mainly in the United States that deal with disaster recovery, FEMA, and we have CDBG-DR funds through the Housing Department. And here in Puerto Rico, we also have 2 agencies that would be El Departamento de Vivienda and Core 3. So we see how there is very direct lines that are centralized through agencies that have proven not to be capable or efficient in moving forward the recovery. In large part, this inefficiency is related to the non-use of local community historical and institutional knowledge. Communities, nonprofits, organizations, local business are being excluded from the planning and the implementation process of recovery. So this tendency that we have seen in the last years to even increase centralized control over recovery efforts really concerns us. It does not ensure transparency, accountability, or resiliency for the most vulnerable in Puerto Rico. And it ignores completely the bottlenecks and corruption scandal inside local and federal agencies. So going directly to the priorities, we have identified the need to promote federal legislation that empowers civil society with effective participation mechanisms. We are working with Chuy Garcia's office in a bill to implement a civil society task force that will empower sectors in Puerto Rico to have direct influence in the planning and implementation process of disaster recovery funds. Also, we call for the reform of disaster recovery in general through changes in FEMA and HUD. For this, we are already promoting the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act, which will fix the ownership not verifiable denials by FEMA by amending the Stafford Act. And we're also supporting the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, which will streamline the CDBG-DR program so that it is implemented more effectively when disaster strikes. Also, we are promoting local voices and trying to change the discourse of corruption to one of vulnerability of the poor in Puerto Rico and the whole nation. We have to start, and this, all of you can help us with these points. We have to push for recovery funds for earthquake survivors that have not been approved by the Senate. The House did approve the earthquake supplemental, but not the Senate. And this is the type of initiative that has been stopped by the discourse of corruption in the island. And this is also tied to promoting the flexibility of the use of funds between disasters. We have been hit by so many disasters that this is really needed. Also, we are promoting the increase of access to funds on economic incentives for local, small and medium business and nonprofits. This would include waivers to matchmaking requirements to federal funding initiatives, and from 501c3 status when there is a local nonprofit status that is used by most of our nonprofits in Puerto Rico. Also, we are promoting with you guys the building of supply chain resiliency, because Puerto Rico is a very indicated place to do this. We have the infrastructure and the knowledge to build the supply chain resiliency and promote local, medium, and small businesses. And finally, in terms of nutritional assistance, we are urgently asking the USDA to publish the pandemic EBT guides that we haven't been able to implement because they haven't published the new guides, and strengthen the NAP program by permanently increasing income thresholds and establishing a health food initiatives program. So I have to stop because I only have 5 minutes, but I am open to all of your comments, questions, and please feel free to reach me. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. That was a very important reminder of some of the limitations in the implementation of even, as we talk about mobilizing the funds, but there is also the execution of the funds and how to do that in a way that is inclusive and takes the best advantage of local knowledge. So thank you for that presentation. And now it is with great pleasure that I also introduce one of our members who is in Puerto Rico. Speaking of the local knowledge, we have with us Heriberto Martinez Rivera. He's General Secretary of the Puerto Rico Bible Society and also coordinator of the Jubilee Puerto Rico Ecumenical Coalition on Death. And he's one of the leaders alongside another of our members, Archbishop Roberto Gonzalez, and also other Puerto Rico leaders that worked on this letter with us that I mentioned at the beginning, where we put forward some of these priorities, and that we are happy that some of them were achieved, but some of them are still we need to continue working on them. We hope we can do that with all of you. Reverend, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Aldo. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Jubilee USA Network and his director, Eric Lecon, for this great opportunity to allow me to be part of this conference. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jubilee team. As many of you know, that Puerto Rico is facing the most severe economic crisis and social in recent years, with a public debt of $72 billion and pension plan basically without money. Near 60% of our population living under poverty level. Unemployment rate is very high, which double the average of the United States. We also face a serious problem of reduction of our population due to migration to the United States. That's very bad for us. The question we have to answer is how we are going to face this reality from humanitarian perspective and social justice. The origin of the debt of Puerto Rico comes from the economic crisis that began in 2000. In 2005, the government of the United States decided to remove the tax exemption of U.S. companies established over here in the island. Since 1976, Washington allowed U.S. companies operating on the island to send their profit to the company headquarters at any time without having to pay federal taxes on corporate income. Over 2 decades, Puerto Rican annual economic balance, show a significant part of the economic was funding around the privilege that encouraged the investment of U.S. companies over here. Puerto Rican recession began immediately after of the tax exemption. The company reduced their operation and closed their business. Reduced their business and closed their operation on the island. The poverty rate shot up to the record level, and unemployment increased at high level. So, to cover the deficit created, Puerto Rican began to borrow deeply with a complex combination of hedge fund and mutual fund until reached the amount of $72 billion. Being territory of the United States, the island could not benefit from the U.S. bankruptcy code. In June 2016, Barack Obama signed the Promise Law, which established the creation of overseas fiscal management board with a commitment to provide the tools to achieve fiscal responsibility and to access to the capital market again. 2017, the hurricane season was so bad for us. The devastation of the public structure and the loss of private property affect the people, the U.S. citizens living over here. What is the situation of Puerto Rico at this moment? One, we are still dealing with the effects of the debt crisis and government bankruptcy. The consequence of the 2017 hurricanes, the earthquakes in the southwest area of the island at the beginning of this year, and the coronavirus pandemic. That's one. The second, the state ability or the government ability to execute public policies in the process of reconstruction of the infrastructure of the island has been affected by years of austerity and private and public corruption, and the bad performance of political parties in the public administration. Third, Puerto Rico has never had control of monetary policy or our international trade policy. Why fiscal policy is controlling right now by the Financial Overseas Management Board, which we have no room to move to anywhere. We don't have any possibility in order to overcome that crisis. Also, the public health system of Puerto Rico is in very bad situation or bad shape. We do not have the capacity to implement an adequate monitoring program to act in time and effectively to prevent the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. Over here, the official data is not clear in any area around the Puerto Rico or the island. Given all about the short-term scenario for the Puerto Rico is very vulnerable. In the case of increases of the price of the COVID-19, it does happen, and does create the possibility to shoot down the economy again, paralyzing both the rebuilding of our infrastructure and the economic recovery. The consequence will be very bad to our economy. That would mean less economic activity, more unemployment, less revenue for the state. Immigration would increase. There would be less investment, and economic contraction will continue on the island. It's not good. It's not good for us. The pandemic is creating an economic and political earthquake, and we have been facing every day over here in Puerto Rico. These are times of uncertainty that threat our ability to adapt to the fundamental change of our society. We are concerned that in the best case scenario, implementing the onerous agenda would require a high level of state capacity for analysis, planning, and execution. Unfortunately, we are not in the best time, and the government capacity has been reduced for our political situation, austerity measure that has been imposed by the fiscal plan and also by the economic crisis. It is so important for the civil society to demand an openness and transparency from the government to avoid corruption, fraud, and political favoritism in this process that is so important to get back on our feet and overcome our economic crisis in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico needs a comprehensive disaster plan relief. A significant funding will be required to rebuild and improve the damaged infrastructure and the island, and help us to face this pandemic crisis, and also to look for ways in order to develop our economic. That's so important for us. Well, thank you, and God bless all of you.
Thank you very much. So I have two questions for the panelists. I don't see any coming on the chat box, so I'm going to ask my own. And I think we have 5 minutes left, and we really need to close them. But one question is that there seems to be a tension. One of the things that there is this amount of funding that was allocated to Puerto Rico, 44 billion at the moment, of which I mentioned the 13 billion that were announced this year. That brings the total to 26 that have been obligated so far. But there seems to be a lot of funding that has been already allocated, but is not being implemented. And at the same time, it seems that the implementation, some of the requirements, if we want an appropriate, an implementation that is open and transparent, may actually create further hurdles for, like the rapid movement of that funding. So is this a tension, or is just an apparent tension? I mean, like, can the funds be moved forward more quickly towards their execution, while at the same time ensuring that there are processes for accountability and transparency in how, an involvement of civil society in how the funds are utilized? That's one question. And the other question is, whoever doesn't pick up this question could maybe say, what is the one thing that they would change to Promesa if, like they had their wish? Today we could change one thing in Promesa to make it better. What would that be? Thank you. Maybe I don't know who wants to start. Yes, you can start.
Let's start with your first question, Aldo.
Yes, go.
Great, and I really appreciate that question because it gives me a little bit of clarification of my presentation. Here in Puerto Rico, when you speak to community leaders, when you speak to nonprofits, when you speak to municipalities, when you touch base with the people that have been on the street working on disaster recovery day by day, they tell you, we just need the funds to get to our hands so we are able to do stuff. And the inefficiency and incapacity of federal and local agencies that I mentioned in my presentation has made it like a drop falling in a same place in our skin, because we know the funds exist, that they have been assigned, but we don't see much progress at all. And we do recognize and we do see that there are problems of lack of transparency, problems of contracts being given to friends, problems of lack of efficient use by the public officials. So that is why we have insisted, Aldo, that the priority is to provide those participation mechanisms where civil society, community leaders, municipalities, nonprofit organizations, philanthropy are able to expedite and oversight recovery. And you would say, oh, but that will bring more layers. But a person without a roof, poor people in Puerto Rico that are suffering will tell you it's not going to get slower than it already is. Like, they already assigned a federal coordinator. They already assigned a fiscal monitor for HUD and the CDBG-DR funds. It has not worked. And it has not worked because it's a centralized solution. We need a solution that decentralizes and empowers civil society, local leaders, local implementators of recovery to plan and implement programs and access local organizations and local businesses to federal dollars in order to build. We don't need more wall. So that's what I would answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Adi. I don't know who of the other panelists wants to go first.
If you allow me to say something, yes. Just add some comments. What's happened over here, especially after the election process that haven't stopped yet. Obviously, the people of Puerto Rico wants to change our reality, especially the corruption reality. Now, in this past election, everything has been changed in Puerto Rico. Now we are going to face a situation where the two major parties going to be leading the government of the island, and it's so difficult for them, for me, that's happened before in 2004, to get together in order to look for consensus, in order to work in the base benefit and the better benefit for my people. But at the same time, new political forces has been taking place and getting to the Senate and the Congress over here in Puerto Rico. And also it's going to be more difficult in order to be getting together, in order to look for the solution. But it's a great signs in this time that my people has been making some change in reaction, change the way that they are making policy over here, try to change a political structure to open the new scenario where other forces, especially community force, different areas can be part of in that place where they are making the decision. That is a new scenario for the Puerto Rican people at this moment with this new process that is going to be starting in 2021. I can listen to you.
Yes, I'm muting and unmuting. Thank you very much. And Laura, I guess you will be left to the closing. If you could say something about the Promesa, what would be your priority reform for Promesa? And we'll close with that.
Laura is not there.
It's like this or not, it actually.
Laura?
He seems to be having problems.
Oh.
I'm so sorry about that. That's a very big question for a very, and I know you want a very short answer. What one thing would I change about Promesa? Well, again, I would go back to the inequitable treatment of the people of Puerto Rico. No other people, no other group of Americans in this country gets the Congress to impose a body to basically oversee them, you know, to make decisions about them. People who aren't even residents of Puerto Rico or aren't Puerto Ricans, right, who are the ones making the decision. So it's hard to say if we just fix this one thing. I mean, this is just, to me, another manifestation of the ways that Puerto Ricans are not treated equitably. You know, the most fundamental issue with Promesa is that they have been given the power and the authority to make decisions about the thing that is crushing Puerto Rico, and that's the debt and how the debt is handled. And so the biggest issue for the island has been put in the hands of people that were not elected by the people, you know, who do not represent the people of Puerto Rico. And that is a real problem. I think, you know, we have seen when the people of Puerto Rico are making their feelings known, that they are the ones who will not stand for corruption, who will not stand for corrupt politicians, who will take to the streets to make sure that their voices are heard and that their wishes are respected. And they can't do that when Congress is the one telling them, this is who's going to be making the decisions for you. So we need to put, as Adi says, power in the hands of the Puerto Rican people.
Thank you very much, Laura. So I think with that, I want to thank our panelists. This was great, very inspiring, a lot of ideas. And so I think we're going to continue feeding this into our agenda and our campaigns. I look forward to continue to work with all of you and also with all of our membership and partners in moving forward these ideas. Now I'm going to close this part, this session, and we're going to move to. Maybe I would ask Eric for guidance here because we have 6 minutes left until the announced time for the next session. So, Eric, we probably have our panelists already here. So, how do you want to proceed?
Sure, thank you, Aldo. I think we can bring the other panelists in. I think if folks want to take a break now, you do have about 6 minutes. I would suggest you stay logged in since we'll be starting in about 6 minutes with our final panel. And we really have, on top of all the amazing speakers today, we're going to close out with the bang. So we're going to stay live, and in 5 minutes, we'll come back with the panel.
Thank you.
And, Zach or the Jubilee team, can you please put up the break panel so folks know the time for reconvening? The break slide.
Yes, one moment.
For everyone, we're reconvening in about 3 minutes for our final event of the afternoon. If you're just tuning in, our final panel for the day starts in just about 2 minutes. Our panelists now are coming in the room. It looks like all of them are here. So we will be kicking off in just a moment. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back. I know people are joining us for our final panel of the day, as well as logging in and continuing the conversation and joining us on Facebook Live, as well as on Twitter. We're very grateful for our final panel today to have really some of the world's best experts on some of the issues that we've been discussing today as we talk about the global response to the coronavirus. Our last panel of the day is entitled Coronavirus Vulnerabilities in Developing Countries, Tailoring Debt, Trade, Tax, Transparency, Climate, and Other Financial Policy Responses. As we've gone through the course of the day, we began the day by hearing from global partners in terms of how the crisis is impacting all corners of the world and how it's significantly impacting and hurting a broad range of developing countries, including middle-income countries. Some of the most significant increases and impacts that are taking place are not only taking in the poorest countries in the world, but also developing middle-income countries. According to recent job loss numbers and poverty statistics, we're looking at countries across Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, that are so-called middle-income countries who are going to see some of the most significant job loss rates and some of the most significant increases in extreme poverty. As we've gone through some of the various campaigns and global responses through the course of today, as well as some of the actions that people are taking to confront the crisis, we've talked about a wide range of issues, from tax and transparency issues to debt issues, trade issues. And on this particular panel, we're going to close out by revisiting that, where some of the global solution is at, and also look at some of the technical issues we're facing in terms of being able to address this particular crisis. Some housekeeping reminders. If you have a question or a comment, we invite you to go ahead and start putting them in as soon as the panelists begin. In order to put a question or a comment in, you're going to have to use the Q&A or the question and answer function. We cannot see the chat. So when you have a question or comment for our panelists, please post that. And as moderator, I will return those questions to the panelists at the end of the event. If you're joining the live conversation on Facebook, what you're able to do is put in the comments section of the live link any questions or comments, and those will also be sent to me for panelists. Or if you have questions, comments, issues you want to raise across Twitter, please put them on Twitter using hashtag Jubilee and or tagging @JubileeUSA, @JubileeUSA, so we can also funnel those questions and comments to the speakers. We're grateful to have hundreds of people joining us today to view the event from various different areas, from Facebook to being in the room with the group that will be able to interact with the panelists this afternoon. The panelists that have gathered and are joining us for this conversation, as noted, are some of the best experts in terms of addressing these issues. We're very grateful to have Jerome Zettelmeyer from the International Monetary Fund, who is going to kick off our panel with a 5 to 8 minute briefing. Jerome is the Deputy Director of Strategy, Policy, and the Review Department of the International Monetary Fund. He's going to focus on some of the vulnerabilities, what are some of the things we can do, and what are the future institutional questions that we have looking at these particular coronavirus response issues, as well as the broader issues. After Jerome, we will hear from Anna Gelpern, a wonderful friend of Jubilee, who's the Agnes Williams Research Professor at Georgetown Law, and talking about some of the policy solutions we really need to address debt vulnerabilities. And then we're going to hear from Catherine Feingold, the Deputy President of the International Trade Union Confederation, as well as the International Policy Director of the AFL-CIO, who we've been working very closely with on a lot of the debt, tax, transparency, and trade responses to the global crisis. Again, if you have any technical issues, you can write those issues in the chat. That's a message that goes to the host. If you need technical assistance, you can also email policy@jubileeusa.org. And again, you can start putting your questions not in the chat, but in the question and answer feature. So first, let me turn it over to Jerome, and so grateful that you're with us and able to spend this time with us today.
Thank you. It's a big honor and pleasure to be here. I work mostly on debt, and so what you're going to get is perhaps a partial view of the broader question that you have asked this panel to address, which in the brief I got was to address the vulnerabilities that the COVID pandemic has created in developing countries and how these should be factored in the design of the international community's financial response. So I want to give you a few sort of facts and then derive some policy implication from those facts. So the first fact is that this pandemic crisis is completely off the charts in terms of its impact on output and on poverty rates in developing countries. So it is, truly an enormous crisis by any historical comparison on these two fronts. So in terms of the output decline, it is, by far the largest, sharpest output decline that we have seen, certainly since the Great Depression, maybe depending on you count it, beyond that. Now, by comparison, however, the impact on debt has been relatively small. So this is true both comparing the debt impact to the impact in terms of these other indicators, but also comparing the debt impact in developing countries to that in advanced countries. So if you want a ballpark figure, is that if you try and get a sense for the debt impact on this crisis by comparing IMF projections for debt levels in low-income countries in 2021, as we made them in October of 2019, to the most recent projection round, right, that takes into account the effect of the COVID crisis, the median increase in debt for low-income countries is 6% of GDP, right? So it's not nothing, but it is relatively modest, particularly compared to the median increase in debt in advanced countries, which is going to be 17% of GDP. The second stylized fact is that we think this crisis is going to have a big impact on debt vulnerability. So it's getting many countries to the brink of defaults, of debt crises, but it does not have an enormous impact in terms of long-term debt sustainability. And the reason for that is that when differences between interest rates and growth rates are relatively small in the long run, as is the case in the current macroeconomic environment, you only need a relatively minor increase in the primary surplus that you generate over time in order to be able to repay your debts. So to a first approximation, countries that had sustainable debts before the crisis are likely to still have sustainable debts after the crisis. This doesn't mean they're in good shape, right? So they will need very large financing for several years, or if they don't get this large financing, they are going to have to compress their spending for several years, and both is really bad. But the point is that the problems involved with this are more of a financing issue than a debt sustainability issue. So the upshot of this is that when you look at the number of countries that have, in our view, clearly unsustainable debts, it continues, and I'm focusing now on middle and low income countries, it continues to be relatively small. So it is, somewhere in the 10 to 15 range. And for the most part, these are countries that already had unsustainable debts or were at the brink of unsustainability before the crisis. And this number also includes a bunch of countries where their debt problem is the result of an underlying problem which is much less tractable and cannot be addressed through debt relief alone. So these are the Yemens, the Zimbabwe's, the Eritreas, and so forth. So where either war or internal government's failure is really at the key of the problem. Okay, so the consequence of this picture is that while debt relief can be part of the solution and is indeed critical in some countries, it is neither necessary nor sufficient in most countries that are hurting. So many more countries need transfers than outright debt relief. Debt relief is one form of implementing a transfer, and it is essential in countries with unsustainable debts. But it's very hard to sell to creditors for the case of countries with sustainable debts. There are other alternatives that are more feasible. So these are grants and concessional lending. So the point is that the pain of this crisis is not limited to the relatively small group of countries that have unsustainable debts, yet the convention in international finance is that only countries with unsustainable debts get debt relief, right? So unless we change that convention, we are not going to be able to use debt relief as the primary instrument in this crisis. Furthermore, some countries with unsustainable debts will need much more than debt relief. So really deep reforms that may not be feasible in the current political setting of these countries to fix that problem. So the scope for using debt relief as an instrument is relatively narrow. It will go to countries that both have debt problems and can commit to reforms, but beyond this group, we will need other instruments. So one interesting question, maybe to end this with, is: are there forms of debt relief that could have broader applicability, including to countries that have debts that, you know, the official community would consider as sustainable? And so one possible such form could be debt to climate swaps. So debt to climate swaps are often motivated by, you know, a deep debt crisis. I don't see them that way, because when you have a deep debt crisis, then, you know, the primary objective and the main difficulty is to get creditors to coordinate on, you know, truly deep debt forgiveness. And if on top of that, you want to use the debt relief to finance an additional spending, to raise spending in the countries on other items, even if these are very, you know, socially desirable items, you're going to need even deeper debt relief to square these objectives. So while debt to climate swaps are not a great instrument to help countries with deep debt problems, they may be a good instrument to help countries that have sustainable debts, but are under a lot of fiscal pressure, and as a result are forced to compress spending in a variety of areas, including climate-related investment. Anyway, so the bottom line is, you know, I see two main challenges. One is to ensure that countries in this narrow group, where debt is unsustainable and where, you know, the political and internal conditions of these countries permit a debt workout that is linked to some sense of reform, that these countries actually get that debt relief. And so even that objective is not entirely trivial, because you need to coordinate creditors and get them to agree, and we can talk about that. Anna Galperin, I suspect, will take that up. There has been some progress in recent months in creating structures which help at least the G20 official creditors to do that, which is important because, you know, the largest of them, as you know, are not members of the Paris Club. And then the second big challenge is going to be to help those countries that for which debt relief is not the right instrument, or not, at least not the instrument through which the richer countries are willing to help to get that help. So let me stop here.
Jerome, and thank you so much for offering that overview and sharing the vastness of the problem we're dealing with. Our next speaker is Anna Galperin. And as I mentioned, Anna Galperin is the Agnes Williams Research Professor of Georgetown Law. For me, Anna is the expert's expert. She gets lots of calls and texts from me when we're trying to figure something out. And it's always her wisdom that is really a guiding force for a lot of our efforts. So without further ado, we're so excited to have Anna join us today. And Anna, you're on mute. And I've been on mute many times today when I'm speaking. So you still are on mute, Anna.
Okay. Oh, great. I'm sorry.
You went back on mute, Anna.
Okay, great. There's an enormous amount of interference.
Try again.
So I don't know if the team is logging Anna back on and off. Perhaps while we figure out the technical difficulties on Anna's part, Kathy, could we ask you to go ahead and let me again introduce Kathy. The AFL-CIO is one of our member organizations, but today Kathy is joining us as the deputy president of the ITUC. Kathy, we're anxious to hear your remarks. Thank you for joining us today.
Sure, thank you. I do see Anna joining. Do we want to just see if she can jump on?
Sure.
Okay. Does this work?
It sounds good. It worked, Anna.
Okay, let's have Anna go first. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Well, thank you. And I'm terribly sorry. I think I was logged on twice or something bizarre happened. So first of all, it's a huge honor to be here. And I admire Jubilee tremendously, both for the creativity, the pragmatism, and the commitment to doing the right thing that has been just the guiding force of this organization for so long, and it's an example to all of us. I'm grateful also for the opportunity to be on this panel and to follow Jeremy, because I think that my initial thoughts follow nicely from what he sketched out as a situation on the ground. In my view, what we're seeing now, and what this crisis seems to illustrate, at least sort of initially, is that the existing institutional architecture we have is not suited to the problems that we are having in this crisis and are likely to have in the near and medium term. So there are 3 or 4 dimensions that I want to highlight, and maybe we can discuss them later on in the panel. One is we've got an institutional architecture for development and emergency support that is linked to national income. Right, so that means that we've got institutions and tools, financing tools for low-income countries. And there's a certain view of what those countries are and what they need, right? These are countries where people live maybe on less than $1 a day. And what they need is a steady flow of sustainable financing, sort of small amounts at low cost, maybe grants over a 40-year period to develop, right? To build infrastructure, institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are middle-income countries that have market access, and they're the ones that are prone to these giant inflows and outflows of capital. What we're finding is that even low-income countries can be susceptible to these large-scale inflows and outflows, whether from a crisis like COVID, where the entire world is suddenly hit by a pandemic. Climate events may have the same sort of an effect, but also some countries have market access, albeit very sporadic and precarious, and so they too can have sort of inflows and outflows that can destabilize and have spillover effects that are substantial. In addition, you have countries that might be middle-income countries, but then you have one hurricane and suddenly they're negative income countries, right? So that, and I'm thinking of course, small island economies where there can be enormous financing needs that come from outside shocks. So I'm not sure that the national income-based architecture is suited to the world we live in today. Second, and Jeremy emphasized this, we've gotten too used to debt relief and debt service relief as an emergency financing vehicle. Countries that have a lot of debt or countries that have unsustainable debt may not be the same countries that need the most financing. Countries can only benefit from debt service relief if they would otherwise be paying a lot in debt service, right? So if I need funds to boost my healthcare infrastructure, debt service relief on the DSSI model will only help me if I was going to pay a bunch of money in debt service in the next 6 months, and I can now reroute it to healthcare. But if I don't have that kind of debt or that kind of certain debt service coming up in the relevant time period, then it's just not for me. This kind of an initiative does nothing for me, right? So I think we need to unbundle financing and debt relief in a more thoughtful way. And this actually goes to some creditor motives and incentives. Different countries have different, and different creditors have different constraints that might make debt relief an easier financing vehicle, an easier way to support vulnerable countries. But it's not clear to me that that's what's needed. And I think Jeremy mentioned this earlier. Another dimension that worries me and where the architecture falls short is we've got an increasingly diverse group of creditors that may or may not be invested in the institutional architecture that we have for creditor coordination. And you hear about China a lot, and I think it's fair because it's a large creditor, but I think it is a system problem rather than a China problem, because precisely of the diversity of creditors involved. It's not obvious that the existing institutions are always the right coordination platforms. We have a transparency and disclosure infrastructure, for lack of a better word, that tends to be geared to external demands, right? So what do I mean by that? When a country issues securities in the international markets, it files a large securities disclosure document. It might file it with a stock exchange. It might file it with the SEC. Well, that is for investor protection, right? It is not for accountability to the citizens whose future earnings we are in fact pledging to repay the debt. The World Bank, the IMF, the BIS, they collect, and OECD, they have been collecting a lot of great data, but the origins of those collection efforts really go back to particular creditor imperatives, a little bit like the SEC's investor protection mandate, which is why we ask for disclosure from the debtors, right? So whereas the disclosure to domestic audiences and domestic accountability is very heterogeneous, very spotty, and I think this is an area where we really have a lot more work to do. And finally, and this is something that struck me also about Jeremy's remarks, the existing architecture is not good at dealing with uncertainty. Think about the uncertainty involved in this crisis. What happens, how it goes, and the impact it has on the debt, on the financing needs, among other things, and of course the health outcomes, depends on a confluence of financial, political, scientific, economic, and policy events and moves that are hard enough to predict in isolation, virtually impossible to game out altogether. And the tools we have to protect vulnerable countries from uncertainty, I think, are very limited and underdeveloped. So I think we should talk some more about potential solutions going forward, but I think that we have a lot of work to do. What I wanted to highlight in my opening remarks is we have a lot of work to do to revisit the institutional architecture within which this crisis is unfolding and update these institutions to the challenges ahead.
Eric, do you want me to jump in?
Sorry, I mute there. Yes, Kathy, please. Thank you, Anna.
Great. Thanks so much. And it's always great to be with Jubilee, one of our great allies, both of the ITUC and the AFL-CIO. There's absolutely no doubt that the crisis has been devastating for working people around the world. And really, I mean, I love what Anna was saying. We say that the global architecture is not fit for purpose for addressing the current just multitude of crises, from the pandemic to economic inequality. So we need to really be thinking about a new model, an economic model that puts well-being of workers, the rights of workers, and the protection of the environment at the heart. And we call it, in the labor movement, we need to build a new social contract. And the International Labor Organization has sort of built in their declaration from last year what that framework would look like. It would be a labor protection floor for all workers, regardless of their employment arrangement, fundamental rights, health and safety, adequate minimum wage, universal social protection, and this is going to be a key one that I'll come back to, a transformative agenda around equality, women's rights, and just transition for climate action as well as technology. So that needs to be part of the thinking when we talk about new global frameworks within which we are going to rebuild with resilience. But we also know that translating that framework into reality, I always like to think that I'm sitting next to, you know, a worker thinking like, how do you translate this so that workers' lives are actually better? And that is going to require a commitment to really finance this kind of social contract. So in order to move from crisis to a new model of resilience, we're going to need to finance for recovery in developing countries. We need to see medium and long-term investment in jobs, and it cannot just be any old job. Let's be clear. I think we've learned that from this current moment. It needs to be jobs that comes with rights, with social protections. We need investments in the care economy and that whole infrastructure, because we've really seen during this kind of crisis all of our vulnerabilities. And we also know that workers have not been affected equally around the world. Although outbreaks of COVID have been worse in advanced economies, the International Labor Organization has documented that, quote, workers in developing emerging economies, especially those in the informal economy, have been disproportionately affected. In the first 3 quarters of 2020, you can see this in the loss of labor income. It was 9% in high income countries compared to 15% in low to medium. So we really need to look at what is the response. It cannot be one size fits all response. The lost working hours in high income countries amounted to 43 million full-time equivalent jobs compared to 143 million in lower middle income countries. We are in a job crisis. The ratio of stimulus is a huge problem. So when we look at, that's the crisis. Now, what has been the response to that crisis? The ratio of stimulus to job loss is 1.08 in high income countries compared to 0.17 in lower to middle income countries and 0.14 in low income countries. So this really presents a huge gap. Closing this gap to enable a really proportional response would require $45 billion in low-income countries and $982 billion in low-middle-income countries. So we really need to be thinking about how we get the right investment. And I agree that, you know, although we've worked closely with Jubilee on debt relief is just one piece of this. We need a whole different framework for financing so that we build back in a way that's resilient, that we're not facing this crisis again next time we have, and we will have another global health pandemic. So we need to deal with a proportional response to the massive damage of the crisis. And we believe if the fiscal stimulus is not closed, there's really going to be damage, very long-term damage in the labor market for years to come. The second big area that the labor movement is focused on is we absolutely must address the need for social protection. Obviously, sitting here in the United States, we can see it firsthand, but around the world, this crisis has really shown the gap in social protection systems. 40% of the world's population has no health insurance or access to national health services. You can imagine what this means during this crisis. And a majority lack income security to take sick leave. Again, we have this in the United States, but this is a model that is that's worldwide. We have to address this. Only 1 in 5 unemployed persons in the world has unemployment benefits. This cannot be the structure. We can't continue to band-aid this. We have to rebuild in a very different way. So that's why the global labor movement is part of a global coalition calling for the creation of a global social protection fund. We would need about $37.8 billion in the first 5 years to close the financing gap and meet some of the sustainable development goals. Funding could be secured through development assistance, corporate taxes, especially a financial transaction tax, and of course, contributions from international financial institutions. This is just so critical. And I know this is a discussion that's going on within the G20. And we hope that other governments will be taking up a leadership role to get this social protection fund built, so that never again are we going to have to be concerned about what will happen to workers during a pandemic. Finally, I wanted to just touch on the piece around the support we need for debt relief. And I just wanted to go back to a point that was made. I think debt relief needs to be linked to, sustainable development goals, not the old model where, it was austerity and privatization, but we need a new model around what does debt relief look like. And I think we need to really see how we link some of these issues to the sustainable development goals. So really looking forward to this conversation. I know we're short on time, but I think the answer that the global labor movement's looking for is building back, not in the same way, differently, in a transformative way that allows working people to live with dignity. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kathy, very much. And thanks to all the panelists for their comments. We have a few questions that are coming in. I would like to actually, along with those comments, pose some very particular questions to our fellow panelists today. Anna, in your comments, you talked a lot about how we need to be looking at some new structures and new financial architecture. I know Jerome alluded to some of this as well. I'm curious, Anna, about your perspective of the past 30 years in terms of having some of these conversations. And I know as a researcher, you've looked back at these conversations going back to World War I, where we're still in some cases having the same international architecture discussions we were having nearly 100 years ago, still talking about vulture funds and these kinds of issues. So given that we've had points like the sovereign debt resolution mechanism in the early 2000s, we had world momentum after the financial crisis of 2008 to move forward perhaps a debt restructuring or bankruptcy process. And again, global agreements where every government in the world agreed to in 2015 on putting forward these processes. I think we look at the absence of such a process, meaning that we did not have the tools to deal with the financial disaster we're experiencing. So in a question to you, I guess I would like to ask your response about, moving forward with the process, what it's meant because we don't have a process, and what are the most important infrastructure pieces we should be looking at. To Jerome, I would like to ask you, since you've raised the vulnerability questions, we do have some questions that are coming in that are critical of the IMF and Bretton Woods institutions for not doing enough. Your presentation was really quite powerful in the sense where you were noting some of the shifts that need to happen, but also acknowledging where we're at with global political will in this particular moment. What's your view in the next weeks and months as many of us are engaging with the IMF and the G20 about what are the next pieces we should be moving forward? So not necessarily those big structural pieces you were alluding to, but what are the most important things in terms of financing, in terms of debt relief, in terms of revenue generation for developing countries we should be looking at? Kathy, if I could ask you, in terms of your comments, I think we're also talking about financial architecture issues when we're talking about stimulus packages where workers are not considered to be the top priority. We're also looking at a great deficiency, as you alluded to, in terms of all of these global financial issues, in terms of how climate is even included. So I'm hoping that when you give some closing remarks, be able to share what are the key elements that we should be pushing on, both from a labor lens as well as a climate lens in the short term, midterm, and long term to improving the architecture in those areas where we have great concerns of it being absent. So perhaps, Anna, first I can turn to you and maybe would ask you if you can in about 2 to 3 minutes. I wish it's, of course, 100 years of history, but yeah, whatever. If you could probably offer some remarks, some sentiment, and also some, I get it's very helpful for us, as you know, Jubilee right now is looking at both short-term, mid-term, but how do we connect the long-term of fixing the financial system? So Anna, please take it away.
So thank you again, Eric. So yeah, in 2-3 minutes, sure. What the heck? Let's fix the world. One of the things that just blows my mind when Eric and I actually were in Geneva together some years ago for UNCTAD, you know, I poked about League of Nations archives, and the stunning thing I discovered was that, you know, back then we were talking about, should we have statutory bankruptcy to deal with government debt? Should we have clauses? How do we solve collective action problems? So on the one hand, it's nice validation that we're not asking stupid questions. On the other hand, it's incredibly depressing that this is not the sort of thing that, you know, we've been talking about it for a while, and you can say the same thing about the conversation 20 years ago, right? So here is my 2 cents. I think perversely, now may be a really interesting opportunity to translate some of the ambitions of the sovereign bankruptcy discussion into concrete institutional forms. I actually think that the 2015 UN resolution is terrific. I think maybe the tactical concern is that we've become so wedded to kind of our views of what bankruptcy is and what is a second, you know, collective action clause is a second best to bankruptcy. Well, that's just hooey, because sometimes they're second best and sometimes they're utterly irrelevant, right? Bankruptcy is a large, complex, comprehensive collective process for allocating like social losses, folks. To think that a puny little contract clause, no matter how well it works, could take care of something like that is, you know, I don't think anybody believes that, right? But what I think we need to do is step back and keep identifying elements of a coordinated, collective, comprehensive debt resolution regime as distinct, again, from a regime that meets development and emergency financing needs, okay? That we can implement at any given moment. So for example, right now, if I'm a private bondholder, I'm dying for sovereign bankruptcy because I think China is eating my lunch, okay? So I'm kind of waiting for demand for comparability and sovereign bankruptcy from, you know, folks that haven't been big fans of it until recently. What does it mean? It doesn't mean we wake up tomorrow and we have sovereign bankruptcy. By the way, you know, the example of Puerto Rico should show you that bankruptcy is only as good as the political consensus that creates it, right? At best, it could buy you time. The distribution is not a foregone conclusion. So as a result, I think, look, we have demand for equal or equitable treatment among creditors. Let's do it. Let's start talking about a shared definition of sustainability, a shared definition of concessionality, a shared definition of comparability. Some of it will be in the Paris Club. Some of it may have to be outside, but the key thing is that to have a platform where these kinds of compromises and discussions can be had. I think the framework that you know, the fund and the G20 were participating in is a nice start, as by the way is the 2015 UN resolution. But I think that we need to take important elements of the picture and try to put those in place. And one last thing I want to say is, look, there's one no-brainer, and I keep talking about it. It's transparency and disclosure for the ultimate constituents of sovereign debt, the citizens, right? There is no reason under the sun why full and transparent and timely useful, intelligible disclosure of sovereign debt cannot be made, and why it can't be a condition of enforcement, condition of authorization. Information enforcing is a huge function of bankruptcy. Let's get this one done. You don't have to call it bankruptcy. Okay, I'll rant over.
Thank you, Anna. That was wonderful. And Jerome, and now to you, what are the next steps, the next pieces we should be looking at in terms of what you outlined in terms of the needs for aid, financing, revenue boosting, and relief?
Thank you. So I think it's useful to put this into 3 buckets. 2 of these I work on directly or indirectly, and the third one I don't. So it's easy for me to be particularly radical on the 3rd bucket, the one I don't have to work on and actually make work in practice. So bucket number 1, I think, is deep debt relief. So on this, there is a general recognition that it will have to happen for a relatively small group of countries on current expectations, at least. This is accepted in the official creditor community among the IFIs, and sometimes this goes under the headline beyond the DSSI, right? So the DSSI was about financing. Now we need to move to deeper debt relief, but now the constraint kicks in. Whether you call it an economic or a political constraint is up to you. This can only be to countries with unsustainable debts. So it's a relatively narrow group. But even for this group of countries, it's not so easy to actually make it happen. And the reason is very simple. It's burden sharing, right? So if you typically have, if you look at a country like Zimbabwe, it owes money to everyone, right? To the private sector, to the Paris Club, to China, to the multilaterals, right? And so how you're not only going to get debt relief with a comprehensive approach where, creditors think that they're not being treated unfairly vis-a-vis other creditors. And also, importantly, you are only going to get it with some efforts on the part of the debtor country itself, because of the sense that burdens need to be shared also between debtors and creditors, right? So this is essentially what drives, if you like, the conditionality that's imposed directly or indirectly, often in the form of IMF programs on such countries, namely a sense that, yes, there needs to be debt relief, but the debtor country needs to do its part. So then whatever it commits to repay after the end of that negotiation actually can get repaid. So the main action item in this area is the so-called common framework for debt restructuring that the G20 have been negotiating. I actually came off a call just this morning on that. So this is something that we consider really important at the fund and a real innovation and not a silver bullet, but certainly a necessary step, which is try to get non-Paris Club creditors, including China, on board with the Paris Club. So in the old days, you had essentially one coordination device among official creditors, which was the Paris Club, and I think most people would think it has worked well. It has actually achieved deep debt relief where it was needed, sometimes with a delay, but by and large it has worked well. And now we have the largest creditor outside the structure, and this can hold up debt relief very considerably. And so the attempt here is that in the G20 framework to organize an understanding, a common framework, which would in effect extend Paris Club principles to G20 outside the Paris Club. It is not the full deal, but the essential step is that it envisages a common memorandum of understanding between the main creditor countries and the debtor countries that lays out the terms of debt relief, so NPV debt reduction, and then also enforces comparability of treatment for private creditors. And so that MOU is then the starting point for negotiations of the participating creditors on their own. So that will be an important step. The second bucket is IMF financing. And so here, basically what you have seen is we had a lot of small emergency loans to a large number of countries back in between April and June. But these are small loans because they are not associated with any form of exposed conditionality, right? So this is why they sort of went out the door so quickly, because they're not tied to onerous conditions. But the fact that we don't have conditionality also is the reason why they're small. So the IMF is supposed to be a self-sustaining emergency lender, and we can only do that typically if we make sure that countries do the reforms that require them to, that we think are necessary for them to be able to fix their underlying problem and then eventually repay. And this is what has been, over many decades getting us into hot water with the likes of you, right? That some of these reforms are unpleasant. And so then there's an argument, is this necessary? Is it not necessary? Are they stupid? Are they counterproductive? We can have that argument, but the principle of conditionality is completely intrinsical to what the fund does. And so these emergency loans have been very successful because conditionality was waived essentially as a result of this emergency conditions. But we cannot do this going forward. And so that the real problem for us is, how do we get countries to come to us and ask for help in a more conventional setting where we will impose conditions, but we don't want to make these conditions so onerous that they don't show up, right? Because we want them to come if they need help and then address our problems with the help of our financing, subject to some conditions. So there's an internal debate on whether we need a sort of a special pandemic type of facility that would make it more attractive for potential borrowers to come to the fund than through the traditional facilities, but still impose some conditionality. So this has been debated for some time, and we will have to come to a solution on that. And then the third sort of bucket is, I think that there is, like I said before, there is the big problem here is not that everyone is now unsustainable, but that the pandemic is just squeezing many countries, right? So we need to create fiscal space for countries that do not, quote unquote, require debt relief in the sense that they have sustainable debts. And so this is kind of tough because you have to induce the richer countries to actually, hand over some money. How do you do that? Well, typically by linking it to spending purposes that the creditors like. And so this is this whole area of SDG bonds, debt for climate swaps, and so forth. And I do think this is an important area. It's not sort of our main business at the fund, but it is an important area because the willingness of taxpayers in advanced countries that are ultimately funding this might just be particularly sensitive to some sets of conditions relative to others, right? So it needs to be sort of teased out. So, it doesn't really make, from a perspective of funding climate investments, it's kind of irrelevant whether you do it by just having straight finance that's linked to a climate goal or whether to do a debt for climate swap, right? What matters is how the money is used at the end. But how you link it, whether you link it to debt or not, might make a difference from the perspective of basically funding, from the funding side, right? And so finding out what is kind of useful to countries that needed money and is most feasible from the perspective of countries or indeed investors, right? Because some of these things could work through private markets that are supposed to be the sources of the money, I think is a very important area.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being with us today. So Kathy, you'll be our final speaker and offer kind of a final response. I guess specifically, I invited you to look at even some of the short-term, mid-term, long-term issues as we're looking at labor issues and climate issues in terms of financial architecture. So I know that some of the short-term issues may be less ambitious, but hopefully move us towards a more ambitious agenda in terms of how we all work together on moving forward a financial system that doesn't leave our planet behind or people behind. Please, we're excited to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks so much, Eric. And I know we could use more time, because I think the conversation around debt and conditionality could probably, as you know, in the labor movement, that's been a debate for many years. And I think that, hearing that debate again, I think one point I want to put forward about this current moment is, I think there's a huge distrust right now in financial institutions and in governments. And so it's so critical that we get this right, the response to the pandemic, that we don't just continue to push out policies that have failed working people and, quite honestly, have denigrated our environment, right? So it is such a critical moment that we think differently. So I really do hope, when we're talking about conditionality, and hopefully that will be the next panel, that we have another opportunity to talk about all of this, that it's grounded in some coherent vision of how this links to the SDGs, how we actually ask the question, will this be good for working people in that country? If you don't get it right, if you don't invest in working people, what we're seeing now is political backlash. So I just wanted to bring that point around getting it right, and building trust and having transparency is going to be really critical. Let me talk a moment about how we see this moment. We don't think it's either or about creating decent work and addressing the climate. I think far too often there's a framework that, it's like labor over here and addressing the climate. They have to go hand in hand. I think a framework around what a just transition looks like, around financing a just transition, making sure that if you're getting workers out of one area of the economy, or building new areas in economies, investing in care infrastructure so that those jobs are actually attractive, and you'll get people moving into care economy jobs because they're not seen as bad jobs anymore. So that's the kind of moment that we're in, that we need to figure out how we get investment in transition, so that we're not pitting workers against each other. We're not demanding, zero carbon jobs without having a plan or a bridge on how to move workers there. So I think that's going to be a critical piece to look at. Again, I think this is a moment of incredible challenge, and at the same time, opportunity. I think one area we haven't talked about a lot, but it's just critical, is the taxation measures that are going to need to accompany all of this. I focus a lot on what's happening to workers in global supply chains right now. We absolutely must reform how taxation happens. We need to establish a minimum corporate tax threshold. We need to eliminate tax havens and illicit trade flows. We need new mechanisms, as I've said before, financial transaction tax. We need to get the US back to the table at the OECD around a digital tax, and we need a wealth tax. So I think, if we look at sort of the whole package that we need to figure out how we reform the taxation. And as I mentioned in the social protection piece, this is also a critical part of the financing for social protection. So I think these are some of the key pieces that we need to making sure that the recovery is both for people and the planet. I think that we need investment that doesn't just look at, often I hear, just the folks working on climate, but they're not working on how does this look at decent work. I want to encourage that when we're talking about conditionality, especially from the IMF, that we never again go back to sort of the labor market flexibility. Labor has been flexibilized to the extreme. And I think the message of this moment is we need to rebuild in a way that protects labor, that builds labor up, that creates new forms of decent work that are both good for the climate and good for workers. And so I would really leave it there, Eric. I think that there's a lot of challenges we're facing. I sort of feel that this is a moment of opportunity. I think if financial institutions can step up, can remake themselves so they're fit for purpose for this moment, is going to be the big issue. What does multilateralism look like in this moment? What needs to change? And again, I encourage, I know we've had these debates with the IMF for years, that we get some new models that are pro-worker, pro-environment. They don't pit those two pieces against each other. And that would be the vision to rebuilding with resilience. So I will leave it there because I know we're short on time.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I think as you noted and others did, this was far too short of a time for this conversation today. So I hope Jerome and Kathy and Anna in the next few months, as decisions move forward, we may be able to invite you back for another conversation that we'll dedicate more time to. And I think as different decisions come down in the next few weeks and into the spring, it's going to be very important to be able to continue this engagement and this discussion because there's a lot of work for all of us left to do. So again, Kathy, Anna, Jerome, and thank you so much for being with us today. This was our final panel, but not our closing. We're very excited that we're going to have a closing prayer from Reverend Nidi Akuri. And before we take that prayer from Anyedi, we're going to hear from one of our board chairs, Steve Herder. At this time, because earlier for those who were at our network council meeting in the day, we know that we will not have board elections until the new year. And so we're only saying goodbye to one board member at that time, and that's who's doing the closing prayer, Nyedi Okuri, who is the head of the Africa Faith and Justice Network, and Nyedi has been a part of our executive committee, our leadership at Jubilee for many years. Nyedi was part of our group that launched our campaigns in February so that we could be prepared and have an all hands on deck response to. So before we hear from Nyedi and he offers that closing prayer, Steve Herder is going to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to everybody who's participating today and part of this wonderful conversation. I just wanted to say briefly a quick thank you to Anyedi for his work, not only with Africa Faith and Justice Network, but also his work for almost the same number of years, past 7, 8, 9 years with Jubilee, and serving on our executive committee and as our treasurer and the chair of the finance committee. And Anyedi also, accompanied Eric to Puerto Rico, assessing the damage of the hurricanes there in 2017, and also went with Eric to Eurodad conference in Slovenia in 2019. So Anyedi, we are so appreciative of you. We're going to miss you, Jubilee USA Network, but we pray God's blessings for you now as you're appointed to be the general promoter of justice and peace for the Dominicans and the permanent delegate to the United Nations Geneva office. So thank you for leading us in prayer to close our time together, Anyedi.
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me? Yes, okay. Thank you very much. And even though I'll be leaving the board, not serving on the board, I promise to stay connected with Jubilee, especially being at the UN office. I know Eric will be keeping a link for us to connect together. And thanks to everybody for today and for the participation and the great contribution. So before we get into prayer, I would like us to just briefly put ourselves in a moment of silence, in the presence of God and in the presence of one another. And as we listen to our breathing, let us be alive and conscious to our connectedness through the same air we breathe, through the life-giving air we all breathe. Almighty ever-living God, you created us, women and men, in a ray of diversity, all in your own image, and you endow us, each and every one, with equal dignity. You continue to shape and renew us every day. Thank you for our time together this day. Thank you for our Jubilee team and for all they do. Thank you for the insights from our presenters. Thank you for our facilitators. Thank you for our co-organizers and participants. God, our Creator, you commanded us to be one another's keeper, to uphold the rights and dignity of each person, to care for one another, especially the weaker members of our human family. Help us, Lord, to understand that our strength lies not in physical or military might, but in how well we take care of one another, especially the weaker members of our human family. May your Spirit transform us more closely into your likeness and make us bridge builders in a world torn by strife and division, riddled with fear and anxiety, and be able to create a world where many members of the human family do no longer feel alienated or are monetized for gains and subjected to all forms of indignities. Precious God, make us effective agents in your hand, that through our actions, we may bear prophetic witness in the service of our sisters and brothers. Enable us, God, to work together to bring our diverse gifts and talents to collectively solve the problems that afflict our human family and afflict our common home, so that we can transform lives through our encounters. May your Holy Spirit embolden us to take action that fashion a world after your will, a world of justice, peace, and love. We make this prayer to the greater glory of your name, you who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Anyeti, and thank you all of you for joining us today. We will early next week send out a packet with action materials and also the recordings of today's events. So if you weren't able to join us for all the various panels that have taken place today, as well as conversations, we'll be posting those so that you could use them and share them. Thank you, everyone. I'm so grateful for your partnership as we continue to move forward our coronavirus crisis response campaigns and be able to address the impacts of the health and economic crisis, as well as the climate crisis and the great challenges our world is facing with inequality. Thank you for being with us.